Caleb Whitlock looked at her the way a man looks at a horse that arrived lame, not with cruelty exactly, but with the flat, practical disappointment of someone who had made a bad investment and was already calculating the loss. Evelyn Whitmore had been standing on his porch for less than 4 minutes. She had traveled 11 days to get here, 11 days in coaches that smelled of wet wool and other people's misery, across frozen plains that offered nothing to look at except more frozen plains, eating hardtack and cold coffee and telling herself that the discomfort was temporary, that discomfort always was, that on the other side of all of it was a door she could finally walk through and close behind her. She was 31 years old. She was not beautiful by the standards of Philadelphia, and she was certainly not beautiful by the standards of whatever this place was, this raw, wind-scoured stretch of Montana that looked less like a home than like a warning. She knew what she looked like. She had known for a long time, a large woman in a brown traveling coat that had been let out twice at the seams with dark circles under gray eyes, and hair that had not recovered from 11 days on the road. She had tried to fix it this morning at the way station, pinning it up as neatly as she could, and the effort had felt both necessary and slightly ridiculous, the way most of her efforts felt. She had told herself it wouldn't matter, that a man who had written to a matchmaking agency and paid for a woman to be sent to him from Philadelphia understood the terms of the arrangement, that he was not expecting a portrait to step off the stagecoach, that what he was expecting, what he had said he was expecting, in the 3 letters they had exchanged, letters she had read so many times the paper had softened at the folds, was a woman of good character and practical ability, someone to help run a household and care for 3 children who had been without a mother for 2 years. That was what she was. That was exactly what she was. Caleb said, "You didn't mention your size." She felt the words land. She kept her face where it was. "You didn't ask," she said. He looked at her for another moment, then looked away toward the tree line, as if the trees might offer him something more useful. He was a tall man, lean in the way of men who worked outdoors, with a jaw that hadn't been shaved in several days and eyes the color of winter sky. That particular gray that isn't quite blue and holds no warmth. He was not unkind looking. That was almost worse. "Come inside," he said, not as a welcome, as a decision about what happened next. Marcet. The house was cold in the way that houses get when someone has been keeping them clean, but not living in them. Everything in its place, nothing warm. 3 children sat at the kitchen table when she walked in, and they looked at her with the unguarded assessment that only children and very old people permit themselves. The oldest was a girl of about 12, dark-haired and sharp-faced, with her father's eyes and an expression that had already decided something. The boy was perhaps 9, thin in a way that suggested recent illness, with a cough he was trying to suppress and not quite managing. The youngest was a girl of maybe 5, small and serious, clutching a rag doll that had lost one of its button eyes. None of them spoke. Evelyn set her bag down near the door. "My name is Evelyn Whitmore," she said. "I've come a long way to meet you." The youngest looked at her doll. The boy coughed. The oldest said, "We know why you came." The flatness of it, the adult precision. It struck Evelyn somewhere between her sternum and her throat. She nodded. "I suppose you do." Caleb moved past her and said, "Clara, mind yourself." To Evelyn he said, "Sit down. There's coffee." She sat. The coffee was terrible, burnt and bitter, the way frontier coffee always was. And she drank it without comment because some things you just drink. He told her at the table, while the children were occupied in the other room and the wind pushed at the windows with the patient insistence of something that had nowhere else to be. He had received a letter from the agency. It had arrived 3 days before she did, which meant he had known before she stepped off the stagecoach, had known when he looked at her on the porch, had already made his decision while she was still believing she was arriving at the beginning of something. The letter said she could not have children. A medical matter, the agency had written, delicately, uselessly, a full month after it should have been disclosed. The information had been in her file. Someone had failed to include it, or had included it too late. Either way, here it was now, sitting on this table between them, like a third person in the room. "I need a mother for my children," Caleb said. "A real mother, not a—" He stopped, looked at his hands. "I need someone who can give this family more children. I have a ranch that'll pass to someone. I need someone who can be a real wife in every way. Evelyn sat with that. She had known this was possible. She had told herself she would handle it. She had believed herself. I understand, she said. Her voice was very even. Then you understand I can't go through with the marriage. Yes. The roads are closed until spring. There's no coach running west until March, maybe April. He said it like a man delivering facts, not like a man who understood he had just told a woman she was stranded. I'm not going to put you out in this weather. I'm not that kind of man. She wanted to ask him what kind of man he was, exactly, but she did not. She looked at the window. Outside, the snow was the color of old bone. What are you offering? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. I've got 3 children who need teaching. Benjamin's behind where he should be in his numbers and letters. He's been sick most of the fall. Clara can read well enough, but she's not learning anything new. Lily's only 5. She needs someone to start her on her letters. A teacher, Evelyn said. Room and board. Until the roads open. She thought about the $300 she had spent to get here. She thought about the letter from her sister in Philadelphia that had said, I don't know why you're doing this, Evelyn. I really don't. She thought about the boarding house she had sold her furniture to leave, and the supervisor at the school where she had taught for 6 years, who had said he was sorry to lose her but hadn't been sorry enough to offer her anything more than a handshake. She thought about standing up from this table and walking out that door into the Montana winter with nowhere to go. All right, she said, I'll teach your children. The room he gave her was small and cold and smelled of cedar from the chest in the corner. There was a washstand and a narrow bed and a window that looked out at the barn. She sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes. She had done this before, given herself a fixed amount of time to feel the thing, and then stopped. Her mother had taught her that, or maybe she had taught herself. The line between the two had blurred. She was rejected and stranded, and it was below freezing, and she was 31, and the last thing she had believed in had just been taken off the table in a kitchen while a man looked at his hands. 10 minutes. Then she unpacked her bag. She was methodical about it. Dresses hung on the hooks behind the door. Books stacked on the small table beside the bed. She had brought 4, because she had never trusted any situation that didn't allow for books. Her teaching materials in the bottom of the bag, chalk, a primer she had used for 6 years and knew the way she knew her own handwriting, a packet of paper she had bought at the way station. When she was done, she went to the window and looked at the barn. A light was on inside. She could see it through the gap in the doors, a thin yellow line in all that darkness. Somewhere inside the house, the boy coughed. She stood there listening to it, the wet, effortful sound of a sick child trying not to disturb anyone, and something in her chest shifted. Not a big thing, a small repositioning, the difference between standing at the edge of something and taking one step back from it. She picked up her primer and went to find him. Benjamin was 9 years old and had the fever brightness about him that Evelyn recognized from her years in the classroom, that particular sharp-eyed look that sick children get, more awake than their bodies can afford to be, running on something that wasn't quite energy. He was sitting up in his bed with a quilt around his shoulders and a look on his face that suggested he had been caught doing something, though all he was doing was being awake at 10 in the evening. Can't sleep? She asked from the doorway. He shook his head, then coughed. She came in and sat on the chair beside his bed, the chair clearly meant for this, worn smooth at the arms, and opened her primer. Do you know your multiplication tables? He looked at her. Why? Because I'm going to teach them to you, starting now if you want, or tomorrow if you'd rather sleep. I can't sleep. Then we'll start now. She taught him 3s and 4s that night, by lamplight, while the wind worked at the windows and the rest of the house slept. He was quicker than he looked. He had the habit sick children sometimes develop of paying very close attention because it's something their bodies will let them do. He tracked what she said and repeated it back and made connections. By the time she told him they were done for the night, he knew his 4s without hesitation. You're a good teacher, he said. You're a good student, she said. Sleep now. She went back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and did not allow herself any more time than that. Clara found her in the kitchen the next morning before Caleb was up. The girl stood in the doorway in her nightgown, dark hair loose, looking at Evelyn with an expression she was old enough to make complicated. Not simple hostility, something more considered than that. You stayed, Clara said. I stayed. Evelyn poured a second cup of coffee and put it on the table next to her own. An invitation, not a demand. Clara looked at the cup, looked at Evelyn, came in, and sat down. My father said you were supposed to leave, she said. Your father said I could stay until spring, to teach you. He said you weren't good enough to marry. The girl said it with her eyes fixed on the coffee cup, and Evelyn understood that Clara knew exactly how sharp it was. She was the kind of child who tested the weight of things before she used them. He said the situation wasn't right for marriage, Evelyn said. Those are different things. Clara looked up. Something moved across her face, quick and guarded, like an animal checking whether the threat was real. My mother died, she said. She died, and he wrote to some agency, and now you're here. I know. I'm sorry about your mother. You didn't know her. No. Then why are you sorry? Evelyn wrapped both hands around her cup. Because you lost her. Because you all lost her. That's worth being sorry about, regardless of whether I knew her. Clara said nothing, but she drank the coffee. The first week was not good, but it was not the catastrophe Evelyn had braced for. She taught mornings in the kitchen, Lily at the table with her letters, Benjamin on the bench beside her working through arithmetic, Clara at the far end doing her reading with the practiced disengagement of someone who had decided to comply without consenting. Caleb came and went. He was a man who found excuses to be outside, which Evelyn understood was less about the ranch work, though there was always ranch work, and more about the particular discomfort of having made a wrong decision that was now sitting at your kitchen table every morning. He spoke to her as little as possible while managing to remain technically civil. He thanked her for things in single sentences. He ate his meals efficiently and left. She noticed he always checked on Benjamin before he went to bed. She could hear his boots on the floor, the murmur of his voice, brief and low. She did not comment on this. She had learned early that the quickest way to make a man feel watched was to acknowledge the things he thought no one noticed. On the 8th day, Lily climbed into the chair beside her without being asked and put the button-eyed doll on the table between them. She needs a new eye, Lily said. She does, Evelyn agreed. Mama was going to fix it. The words fell into the kitchen with the weight of something that had been held for a long time. Evelyn looked at the doll. It was a careful piece of work. Someone had sewn it with real attention, the seams even, the face embroidered with small, careful stitches. Do you have a button? Evelyn asked. Lily thought about this with great seriousness. There's a tin in the sewing basket. Then let's find one that matches. It took 20 minutes to find the right button, not because there was any shortage, but because Lily had opinions, strong and specific, about which button was right, and Evelyn had learned in 6 years of teaching that 5-year-olds with opinions should generally be allowed to exercise them on buttons. When they found it, a small black button, slightly smaller than the remaining eye, Lily held it up to the light and turned it and looked at it from 3 angles. That one, she said. Evelyn sewed it on. She wasn't particularly good at sewing, she was the first to admit that, and the button sat at a very slightly different angle than the original, which gave the doll a look of mild, perpetual curiosity. Lily held the doll out and studied it for a long moment. She looks surprised, she said. She does a little. Lily looked at Evelyn. That's okay, she said. I think she likes it. She climbed down from the chair, doll clutched to her chest, and went toward the other room. At the doorway, she stopped without turning around. Thank you, she said. Small and formal, the way very young children are sometimes more formal than adults. Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen table with the needle and thread and the button tin, and the kitchen was quiet except for the wind, and she did not let herself feel too much about it because she had learned that lesson already. But she did let herself feel a little. It was the neighbor woman, Mrs. Garrett, who said it first to Evelyn's face, though Evelyn had known it was being said behind her back from the day she arrived. Mrs. Garrett came by on the 11th day with a pot of stew that was clearly both a kindness and an investigation, and she sat at the kitchen table and looked at Evelyn with the forthright assessment of a woman who had decided that directness was the same as decency. "I heard Caleb turned you down," she said. "The arrangement didn't work out," Evelyn said, "because you can't have children." Mrs. Garrett said it plainly, without apparent malice, which almost made it worse. "Word gets around fast out here. Nothing personal." "I understand. I'm not trying to be cruel." Mrs. Garrett looked at her stew, then back at Evelyn. "I'm just telling you what people are saying, so you know. They're saying you came all that way, and he took one look and sent you back. They feel sorry for you." She paused. "And some of them think you should have disclosed it before you got on the coach." Evelyn looked at the woman. She was maybe 60, weathered and direct, the kind of woman the frontier built if it didn't break you first. "What do you think?" Evelyn asked. Mrs. Garrett considered this with evident fairness. "I think you're here, and you're teaching those children, and Benjamin hasn't coughed as much this past week, which is more than the last two women who came through managed." She picked up her cup. "I also think you've got a harder road ahead of you than you're letting on, and I'm not sure this ranch is the place for you." "It's the only place available at present," Evelyn said. Mrs. Garrett almost smiled. "Fair enough." She left the stew and the opinion in equal measure, and Evelyn stood in the doorway watching her wagon disappear down the snow-packed track and thought about what it meant to be talked about in a place where you had nowhere else to go. Then she went back inside and started on the afternoon lesson. It was on the 15th night that she heard Caleb in the front room, very late, the sound of a chair scraping, and then nothing for a long time. She had been awake. She was often awake, the cold and the unfamiliar sounds of the house keeping her in that uncomfortable half-sleep that was worse than no sleep at all. She lay still and listened to the silence that followed the scraping chair. She was not going out there. Whatever that silence was about, it was not her place. She was here because she had no other choice. She was here to teach 3 children and wait for the roads to open and then go back to whatever Philadelphia had left for her, which was probably a boarding house and a school that might or might not take her back, and her sister saying, "I told you," in the particular way she had of saying it, that meant she was trying not to. She was not here to involve herself in Caleb Whitlock's grief, or his regret, or his long late-night silences. That was not the arrangement. The arrangement was clear and small and survivable. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind. And then, from the front room, she heard it. The smallest sound, barely a sound at all, something between a breath and something worse, quickly controlled, quickly stopped. She lay there for another minute. Then she got up, pulled her coat over her nightgown, and went to find him. He was sitting at the table with a photograph in his hands. He heard her come in and had himself under control by the time she reached the doorway, but he hadn't had quite enough time, and she could see what the night had cost him in the set of his jaw and the redness at the edges of his eyes. He was pretending wasn't there. She didn't say anything. She went to the stove and stoked it. It had gone low, and put the kettle on, and didn't look at him. And when the water was ready, she made 2 cups and put one on the table in front of him. She sat down across from him and drank her coffee. He looked at the photograph and then set it face down on the table. "Her name was Margaret," he said. Not to Evelyn exactly, more to the air. "She'd been sick for most of the last year. I kept thinking she'd get better." Evelyn said nothing. "Clara was the one who found her. She was 12. He picked up his cup, set it down without drinking. "She hasn't cried since. Not once. I've watched her. Not once." Evelyn thought of Clara's careful testing, the button-sharp precision of her cruelty, the way she came and sat down when a cup was put on the table. The grammar of a child who had learned that softness was a liability. "She will," Evelyn said. "Eventually. When she's sure it's safe." He looked at her. It was the first time he had looked at her with anything other than the managed distance of a man handling a situation. "And when will that be?" he asked. "I don't know," Evelyn said, "but she will." They sat there for a while longer with the stove warming and the wind outside doing what it did. And when Evelyn went back to bed, she did not analyze what had happened or assign it any meaning larger than what it was. A man had been awake with his grief, and she had sat with him, nothing more than that. But she lay awake for a long time after, and the cold felt slightly less cold than it had. The morning after she sat with Caleb in the front room, nothing was different and everything was slightly off-center. The way a picture hangs crooked and you can't stop noticing it even when you're trying not to look. He was already out when she came to the kitchen. The coffee was made, she hadn't expected that, and there was a note on the table that said Benjamin's cough was bad in the night. I gave him the medicine from the shelf. No signature, just the facts, delivered in handwriting that was blunt and serviceable. A man who had learned to write for function rather than expression. She read it twice, poured her coffee, and went to check on Benjamin. He was awake and pale, the cough shadows under his eyes deeper than usual, but his fever had come down from wherever it had been in the night. He looked at her with the particular alertness of a sick child who has been awake long enough to start thinking. "Pa was in here 3 times, he said. "Was he?" "He thought I was sleeping." Benjamin considered this with mild philosophical interest. "I wasn't." "How do you feel?" "Bad." He said it without complaint, just assessment. "My chest feels like something's sitting on it." She pulled the chair close and put her hand to his forehead. "Cooler than yesterday, not cool enough." "We'll keep you in bed today. No lessons." He looked briefly disappointed, which she noted and filed away, because a 9-year-old who was disappointed about missing lessons was a 9-year-old worth paying attention to. "Can you read to me instead?" he asked. She had 4 books. She let him choose. He picked the one about the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was the heaviest and most battered of them, and she read to him for an hour while the morning light came in gray and thin through his window, and the ranch outside went about its winter business. Clara found her afterward in the kitchen and stood in the doorway with her arms crossed in the way she had. That particular defensive architecture that Evelyn was learning to read. "He does that when he likes something," Clara said. "Asks people to read to him. He picked a good book. He always picks that one." Clara came in, not all the way, just enough that she wasn't technically in the doorway anymore. "Mama used to read it to him. He's heard it so many times he probably knows it." Evelyn said nothing, just kept her hands on her coffee cup. "He doesn't remember her voice anymore," Clara said. "He told me. He said he can't remember exactly what it sounded like." She said this with the flatness of someone reporting a fact that had cost them something to learn. "He was upset about it." "That happens," Evelyn said carefully. "It doesn't mean he's forgotten her." "I know that." A beat. "I still remember her voice. I remember everything." The way she said it. Not proud, not sorrowful, something that was the uncomfortable combination of both, made Evelyn set down her cup and look at the girl properly. Clara was 12, and she was carrying something that a 12-year-old should not have had to carry, and she was carrying it with the tight-jawed competence of someone who had decided that carrying it well was the only dignified option. "That's a hard thing," Evelyn said, "remembering everything." Clara looked at her. "Why?" "Because it means you can't forget even the parts you might want to." Something shifted in Clara's face, quick, small, gone, before it fully formed. She looked away. "I have lessons," she said, and left the kitchen. The lessons that week were different, though Evelyn couldn't have said exactly when the difference started. Lily had taken to arriving early, sometimes so early that Evelyn was still eating breakfast, climbing into her chair with her doll, and waiting with the patient gravity of a very small person who had decided that this was where she was supposed to be. Clara still sat at the far end of the table with her reading, still wore the expression of someone complying without consenting, but she had stopped making the small pointed comments she had deployed in the first week, the ones designed to establish that she was here under protest and intended everyone to know it. She still didn't look at Evelyn directly for more than a few seconds at a time, but she had stopped looking away with the quick deliberateness that was its own kind of statement. Benjamin, confined to his bed, got his lessons at his bedside. Evelyn brought the primer and the chalk and worked through his arithmetic with him propped up on pillows, and he worked hard in the way sick children sometimes do, with a focused intensity that she suspected was partly genuine interest and partly the sheer relief of having something to do. On the 4th day of his confinement, he said, "Am I going to get better?" She looked at him. He was asking it the way children ask things when they've been thinking about it for a while, not casually, but with the careful precision of someone who has been rehearsing the question. "Yes," she said. "How do you know?" "Because your fever is going down and your cough is getting less frequent, and you have a good constitution." What's a constitution? Your body's general, the way it's built, how strong it is. Pa says I'm not strong. She stopped writing on the slate. Did he say that to you? He said it to Mr. Garrett. He said he worries because I'm not... Benjamin stopped, searched for the word. Sturdy. He said I'm not sturdy. She thought carefully about what she said next, because this was the kind of moment where the wrong words did damage that lasted. I think your father worries because he loves you, she said. Worried people sometimes say the fear out loud when they mean to say something else. Benjamin turned this over. What did he mean to say? Probably that he was scared of losing you too. The two landed quietly between them. Benjamin looked at the window. Oh, he said. She picked up the chalk again. 7 times 8. 56, he said, still looking at the window. Then he looked back at her. I knew he wasn't being mean. I know you did. I just wanted someone to say it. She wrote the next problem on the slate and didn't say anything else, because sometimes the right response to a child saying an honest thing is to let it have the space it deserves, and then move on. Caleb came in for supper that evening with mud on his boots and a cut on his left hand he was pretending wasn't there, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had already bled through. Evelyn saw it. Lily saw it and made a sound of alarm. Clara put down her fork. It's nothing, Caleb said, and sat down. Let me see it, Evelyn said. It's fine. It's bleeding through the cloth. She said it without heat. Let me see it. He looked at her with the particular resistance of a man who is accustomed to managing his own injuries in private and found the alternative uncomfortable. Then he held out his hand. It was a clean cut, barbed wire, she guessed, by the angle of it, about 2 inches long on the heel of his palm, not deep enough to need stitching, but deep enough to need proper cleaning and binding. She cleaned it with the alcohol she had found in the medicine cabinet and wrapped it with linen from the sewing basket while he sat with his jaw set and his eyes on the far wall, and Lily stood beside him patting his arm with the solemn comfort of a 5-year-old who had decided this was her role. Does it hurt? Lily asked. Some, Caleb said. Evelyn fixed my doll's eye, Lily told him. She can fix things. He glanced at Evelyn. Quick, then away. There, Evelyn said, and tied off the bandage. Thank you, he said. It came out slightly rough, like a word that wasn't used often enough to come out smooth. How's the fence? She asked, because she had learned that moving directly to something practical was the fastest way past whatever this was. 2 posts down in the south pasture. I'll get to the other ones tomorrow. He looked at his wrapped hand. Assuming this cooperates. It will if you don't use it as an excuse to skip the bandage. Clara made a sound that might have been the very beginning of a laugh, quickly stopped. Caleb looked at his daughter. She was looking at her plate with great concentration. He looked back at Evelyn. I'll leave it on, he said. Well, the trouble with the community came in a shape Evelyn had anticipated but not timed. She had known it was coming, had seen it in Mrs. Garrett's frank assessment, in the way the 2 men at the general store had gone quiet when she came in to buy chalk and thread, in the particular deliberate courtesy of the storekeeper that meant he was being polite on purpose. It arrived in the form of a church social at the Garrett farm on a Saturday afternoon in February, an occasion that Clara announced over breakfast with the air of someone delivering information she expected to be complicated. Mrs. Garrett does it every winter, Clara said. Pa goes. We all go. She paused. Usually. Will you go this year? Evelyn asked. Pa says we will. Another pause, loaded with something she was deciding whether to say. People will talk. They're already talking, Evelyn said. Clara looked at her with a species of respect she hadn't shown before, the kind that comes from recognizing that someone else sees a situation clearly. Yes, she said. They are. Caleb said he would go and that Evelyn was welcome to come or to stay. The choice was hers, with the tone of a man who had thought about both possibilities and didn't have a strong feeling about either, which meant he had a strong feeling about both and was managing them. She went. The Garrett farm was larger than she'd expected, and the social was the kind of thing the frontier did, practical warmth, food that was better than it should have been given the season, children running through the spaces between adults with the efficient chaos of children who have been penned up all winter. There were maybe 30 people. She felt every pair of eyes in the room when she walked in, not all of them hostile, some just curious. A few with the frank assessment of people deciding where something fit, but a cluster near the fireplace. 3 women and 2 men who stopped their conversation when she entered and resumed it in a different register, quieter, directed inward, the unmistakable grammar of a group discussing you while you are in the room. Mrs. Garrett came and took her arm immediately, which Evelyn understood was both kindness and strategy. "Come meet Ruth Albright," she said. "She taught school in Nebraska before she married. You'll have something to talk about." Ruth Albright was a small, sharp-faced woman in her 40s who had the kind of eyes that looked like they were always doing arithmetic. She looked at Evelyn without the careful management most of the others used. "Heard you're teaching the Whitlock children," she said. "I am." "How are they?" "Benjamin is recovering from a chest illness. Clara is bright and hasn't been challenged enough. Lily is 5 and has strong opinions about buttons." Ruth Albright blinked. Then something shifted in her face, and she laughed. A short, genuine thing. "That sounds about right for a Whitlock." She lowered her voice fractionally. "Clara was in my school for 2 weeks before Caleb pulled her out. She was reading 2 years ahead of anyone else and bored clean through. I told him he needed a dedicated teacher, and he said he'd see to it." "He's seeing to it now," Evelyn said. Ruth looked at her with the arithmetic eyes. "Are you staying?" "Until spring." "And then?" Evelyn held her cup. "I don't know yet." Ruth nodded once, as if this was a more honest answer than she'd expected, and she appreciated it. "Well," she said, "if you need anything, books, materials, I've got a decent collection gathering dust. Come by." It was more than Evelyn had hoped for from the afternoon. She held on to it. The other part of the afternoon came from the cluster by the fireplace. His name was Douglas Hale. She learned it later from Mrs. Garrett. And he was a big man with the confident ease of someone accustomed to having opinions that went unchallenged. He waited until Caleb was across the room talking to another rancher before he came to stand near Evelyn, not quite addressing her, in the way of a man who wants to say something to someone without the social cost of saying it directly. "Strange business," he said to the air near her. She looked at him. "Woman comes all that way and doesn't make the grade." He shook his head with the performance of someone performing mild sympathy. "Seems like that kind of information should have been front and center before anyone wasted a trip." "That's between me and Mr. Whitlock," Evelyn said. "Sure it is." He looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile. "Still, you'd think a woman in that situation would have been up front. Save everyone the trouble." She felt the thing she always felt in these moments. The heat in her chest, the quick animal instinct to say something that would make it stop. And she did what she had learned to do with that feeling, which was to wait exactly 3 seconds before she opened her mouth. "You'd be surprised," she said, "what information people decide to withhold until it's convenient for them." She looked at him steadily enough that he understood she was not talking about herself. He said nothing else. He moved away with the dignity of a man pretending the exchange hadn't gone the direction it had. Mrs. Garrett appeared at her elbow approximately 45 seconds later. "I saw that," she said quietly. "It was nothing. Douglas Hale has been trying to buy Caleb's south pasture for 3 years. The man has a talent for finding pressure points." She paused. "Don't underestimate him." Evelyn looked across the room to where Hale had rejoined his group. "I don't intend to," she said. On the ride home, Clara sat beside her in the wagon and did not speak for the first mile and a half, which was about right. Lily had fallen asleep against Caleb's arm. Benjamin was in the back with a blanket, watching the sky. "Mrs. Hale told Mrs. Porter that you had your cap set for Pa," Clara said to the dark ahead of them. "That you're staying because you don't want to go home." "People say things," Evelyn said. "Is it true?" "No." She meant both parts of it and made sure her voice was clear enough to carry them both. Clara thought about this for a moment. "Mrs. Hale isn't very kind," she said. Not as a defense of Evelyn, exactly, more as a conclusion she had reached independently and was reporting. No, Evelyn agreed. Mama didn't like her either. A long pause. She said there were women who built themselves up by talking other women down, and that was a sorry way to live. Evelyn looked at the road and said nothing, because the right response to a 12-year-old quoting her dead mother's wisdom was to let it stand. She was right about a lot of things, Clara said. Her voice had gone careful, the way it went when she was saying something she hadn't fully decided to say yet. Mama was. She sounds like she was, Evelyn said. Clara didn't answer, but when the wagon hit a rut and jostled them together, she didn't move away. Benjamin was up by the end of the second week of February, thinner than before but vertical, which felt like a victory. His cough had settled into something occasional and manageable, and he came back to the kitchen table for lessons with the look of a person returning from somewhere difficult and glad to be back. He had opinions about his return. He wanted to learn history now, in addition to arithmetic and letters. He had thought about this, he said, during his confinement. Specifically, he wanted to know about battles. Not the blood, he said quickly, with a glance at Evelyn that suggested he knew this clarification was necessary. The strategy. How people figured out what to do when everything was going wrong. She taught him about Gettysburg. Not just the fighting, the decisions, the terrain, the information commanders had and didn't have. What happened when someone made a calculation that didn't account for what they didn't know? Benjamin listened with his whole body, the way children listen when something has genuinely caught them, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. So he didn't know where the other side was, he said about one of the commanders. Not exactly. He knew approximately, but approximately wasn't good enough. And that's why it went wrong. That's part of it. Benjamin sat back. You have to know what you don't know, he said. She looked at him. He was 9 years old and had arrived at something that took most people considerably longer. Yes, she said. That's exactly it. He nodded, satisfied, as if she had confirmed something he'd already suspected. Clara, at the far end of the table, had put down her reading at some point during the conversation and was listening without pretending otherwise, which Evelyn noted and did not comment on. Caleb found her in the barn on a Tuesday afternoon in late February. She had gone out to look for a particular tool. She had noticed a shelf in the kitchen that had been wobbling for 2 weeks, and there was a simple fix if she could find the right implement, and had gotten sidetracked by the barn itself, by the way it was organized, or rather, the way it had been organized sometime in the past, and had since developed the accumulated disorder of a space run by someone who was very good at the work and not particularly focused on the system. She was studying a wall of hanging tack with the assessing look she gave to things that could be made to work better when she heard him come in. "What are you doing in here?" he asked. Not aggressive, genuinely puzzled. "Looking for a hammer. There's a shelf in the kitchen that needs attention." She looked at the wall. "You've got a reasonable setup here, but you're keeping the bitted bridles too close to the moisture. The leather'll dry out." He looked at the wall. Margaret organized this. She heard the weight of it. "I'm not suggesting changing it," she said carefully, "just moving those 3 across to the other side." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The hammer's on the workbench. Far end." She went and found it. When she turned around, he was still standing at the barn door, looking at the tack wall. "She liked things a certain way," he said, to the wall. "Most people do. I haven't—" He stopped. Started again. "I haven't moved anything since she died. In the house, the barn. I left it all where it was." He said this like a confession, like something he had not meant to say out loud, and now that it was out there, it needed to be owned. "The children probably think I don't know what they think." Evelyn held the hammer at her side and did not say anything. "Claire goes in her room sometimes," he said. "Sits in there. She doesn't know I can hear her. She doesn't cry. She just sits." He looked at the floor. "I don't know what to do with that." "Nothing," Evelyn said. "Right now, nothing. You let her sit there." "That's it?" "That's it." He looked at her with the same expression he'd had the night in the kitchen. like she'd said something he hadn't expected, that landed somewhere that mattered. Then he nodded, once, and looked away. "The shelf is the third one on the right side of the kitchen," he said. "It's been meaning to get fixed since October." "I'll get to it," she said. She walked past him out of the barn with the hammer, into the cold white afternoon, and did not permit herself to think too carefully about the conversation, because thinking too carefully about it would assign it a shape she wasn't ready to give it. She fixed the shelf, and while she was fixing it, Lily stood beside her and watched with the concentrated attention she gave to all practical operations. "What are you doing?" Lily asked. "Tightening the bracket. It's loose." Evelyn showed her the bracket. "See how it pulls away from the wall? That means the screw isn't holding properly." Lily examined this with great seriousness. "Can I help?" "Hold this steady while I tighten it." Lily held the shelf with both hands, the rag doll tucked under one arm, her face set with the gravity of someone performing a critical operation. Evelyn tightened the bracket, and the shelf sat firm. "Done," Evelyn said. Lily let go, carefully, and tested the shelf with one cautious push. "It doesn't wobble anymore," she said, with the satisfied finality of a foreman signing off on completed work. "It doesn't." Lily looked at her. "Are you going to fix other things?" The question was simple on its surface, and Evelyn understood it wasn't simple. She looked at this small, serious child with her button-eyed doll in her mother's chair at the kitchen table, and her absolute certainty that the woman who had fixed the doll and the shelf was someone worth keeping. "I'll fix what needs fixing," she said, "while I'm here." Lily seemed to think about whether "while I'm here" was sufficient. She looked at the shelf again, then she nodded, with the decisiveness of a child who has decided to accept the available terms. "Okay," she said. The end of February came hard. 3 days of weather that locked the ranch down and kept everyone inside, which was the frontier equivalent of a test of character. The children were restless, Caleb was wound tight from enforced inactivity, and the house had the particular cabin fever pressure of a family that didn't quite know what to do with each other in proximity. Evelyn kept to the lessons and added games in the evenings. The sort of things she'd learned kept children from unraveling, word games and number puzzles. And one evening, a map she drew from memory of the United States that became a 3-hour session of Benjamin asking questions and Clara adding corrections, and Lily labeling everything she could think of with a determined, if creative, phonetic spelling. On the second evening, Caleb sat down at the table. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask. He simply pulled out the chair at the end of the table and sat in it, and Lily immediately moved to sit beside him and explain the map to him with the authority of someone who had recently acquired expertise. Clara glanced at him, then at Evelyn, then at the map. "Montana is wrong," she told Evelyn. "It's bigger than that." "Draw it correctly," Evelyn said, and gave her the pencil. Clara drew Montana correctly. It was, in fact, bigger than Evelyn had made it. And Benjamin argued about the placement of the Dakotas, and Lily labeled a large area near the middle here, with complete confidence. And Caleb sat at the end of the table and watched his children argue about geography with an expression on his face that Evelyn caught once in her peripheral vision and did not look at directly. It was the expression of a man seeing something he had been afraid he might not see again. She kept her eyes on the map. It was Clara who came to her room on the last night of February. Late, past 9, past when Evelyn had put out her lamp and was lying in the dark listening to the wind try the windows. A knock, quiet but deliberate, and then Clara's voice. "It's me." Evelyn lit the lamp. "Come in." Clara came in and stood near the door in her nightgown with her dark hair loose. She looked younger than 12 like this, less armored. She was carrying something, and when she came closer, Evelyn saw it was a small photograph. "This is her," Clara said. She held it out. Evelyn took it carefully. Margaret Whitlock had been a fine-boned woman with dark eyes and a serious mouth, photographed in the formal style of the era, with her hands folded in her lap and her spine very straight. But something in the set of her eyes, some intelligence or warmth caught at the corner of them, had survived the stiffness of the sitting. "She's beautiful," Evelyn said. She meant it. "She wasn't always that serious," Clara said. "She laughed a lot. The picture doesn't show it." She took the photograph back and looked at it herself. "I wanted you to know that. That she wasn't just, she looked for the word, stern. She wasn't just stern, she was funny. She made puns, bad ones. Pa hated them. He always laughed anyway. Evelyn watched her. I don't want you to think we're a family that doesn't laugh, Clara said. We used to. I can see that, Evelyn said. In Benjamin, in Lily. Lily doesn't really remember her. Clara said it without blame, just factually, with the resignation of someone who has accepted an unfair distribution of something valuable. She was 2 when Mama got sick, 3 when she died. She remembers feelings, I think, not really her. That happens. I know. Clara looked at the photograph for another moment, then tucked it against her side. I just wanted you to know who she was. So you weren't... She stopped. Evelyn waited. So you weren't filling in the space with something wrong, Clara said finally. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. It was, she thought, one of the most precise things anyone had said to her about what she was doing here. The fear of a child that the woman in her mother's kitchen would become a wrong version of something. That absence would be filled with the wrong shape. I'm not trying to fill any space, Evelyn said carefully. Your mother's space is your mother's. I'm just here, doing what needs doing. Clara looked at her for a long moment with her father's winter-gray eyes. Okay, she said. And then quietly, with the effort of someone unclenching a fist they'd been keeping closed for a long time. Thank you, for Benjamin, for Lily's doll, for... She stopped again, let the for stand without finishing it. You're welcome, Evelyn said. Clara went back to her room. Evelyn sat with the lamp on for a while afterward, looking at the cedar chest in the corner and the books stacked beside the bed and the hammer she'd left on the windowsill and forgotten to put back. She was 31 years old, and she was in a room that wasn't hers, in a house that wasn't hers, in a territory she hadn't planned to be in, and she was here because there had been nowhere else to go. But somewhere in the past 6 weeks, nowhere else to go had quietly become something she didn't have a word for yet. She put out the lamp. Outside, the wind had finally stopped. March came in the way Montana always delivered it. Not gently, not with any suggestion that winter was actually finished, but with a kind of grudging loosening, like a fist opening one finger at a time. The snow was still deep, but the quality of the light had shifted, something in the angle of it that made the mornings feel less like endurance and more like waiting for something. Evelyn noticed it first from the kitchen window on a Monday morning, that particular slant of early light across the yard, and she stood there with her coffee and let herself think, for the first time with any seriousness, about what happened when the roads opened. She had not let herself think about it before. It had seemed unproductive, like standing at the edge of a roof and looking down. But March was here now, and the thinking was going to happen whether she managed it or not, so she may as well do it while the coffee was still hot. What was in Philadelphia, her sister's house, where she could stay temporarily and would be reminded of it constantly? A school that might take her back, with a supervisor who would be kind about it, and slightly condescending, because that was his nature. A boarding house where she could afford a room if she was careful with money she was not currently earning. A city that knew her as the woman who had gone to Montana to get married and come back without a husband, which would be said with varying degrees of sympathy depending on who was saying it and how much they had liked her before. What was here? 3 children who were learning things, and a man who had started leaving coffee made in the mornings, and a barn that needed its tack moved away from the moisture, and a shelf that no longer wobbled. She was still standing at the window when Lily came in and climbed into her chair and put her doll on the table and said, "What are you looking at?" "The light," Evelyn said. Lily looked at the window with the seriousness she brought to all observations. "It's different," she said. "Yes." "Is that bad?" Evelyn turned from the window. "No," she said. "It's just different." She put down her cup and started on breakfast, and Lily watched her with the focused attention she'd developed over the past weeks. The look of a child studying how a thing was done because she intended to know it. Well, the man arrived on a Wednesday. He came in a good wagon, better than most out here, with a driver who sat up front with the particular posture of a hired man performing hired man neutrality. The wagon stopped in the yard, and the man who climbed down was not from here. Everything about him said so, from the quality of his coat to the way he stood in the mud without appearing to notice it. the ease of someone who understood that the mud was someone else's problem. He was perhaps 55, broad through the shoulders with the beginning of heaviness in his jaw, and he had the careful pleasantness of a man who had learned that pleasantness was more efficient than intimidation, and used it the way other men used a tool. Evelyn was hanging washing on the line near the house when he came in, a job she had taken over from no one since it had simply not been getting done, and she watched him cross the yard toward the barn where Caleb was working. She couldn't hear what was said. She could see Caleb come out and stand in the barn doorway, and she could see the other man's hands moving in the easy gestures of someone laying out a proposition, and she could see Caleb's shoulders and what happened to them over the course of the conversation, which was that they went from neutral to careful to the particular stillness of a man who is keeping himself from responding the way he wants to. The conversation lasted perhaps 12 minutes. Then the man went back to his wagon, and the driver took it out of the yard without particular hurry, and Caleb stood in the barn doorway watching it go. He was still standing there when Evelyn finished with the washing. "Who was that?" she asked. Caleb didn't look at her immediately. "Silas Crow." She waited. "How? He owns most of the land east of the Garrett property. Has for 6 years since he bought out the Hendersons." Caleb finally looked away from the direction the wagon had gone. "He wants to buy my south pasture." "You said no." "I said I'd think about it." He said it with the tone of a man who had said something he already regretted. "Which I won't." But saying no outright seemed like it needed more thought first. She looked at him. "Why does it need thought?" He picked up the tool he'd set down when Crow arrived and turned it in his hands without using it. "Because Crow isn't the kind of man you tell no without understanding what that means." He paused. "He's been buying land out here for the better part of a decade. He doesn't buy it because he wants to run cattle. He buys it because he wants to own it. There's a difference." "What does he want with the south pasture specifically?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. And that's the part that concerns me." She thought about it through the afternoon lessons, which she managed by habit, while the part of her mind that was not conjugating verbs or checking arithmetic worked at the problem the way she'd always worked at problems. Not directly, but in parallel, the way you can sometimes see a dim star better by not looking straight at it. What she knew about Silas Crow was what she'd picked up from 6 weeks of listening in a community where listening was available to anyone patient enough to do it, that he had come from somewhere east and wealthier, that he had arrived in this part of Montana with capital that suggested either old money or the kind of business success that didn't invite close inspection, that he had acquired land with the systematic patience of a man working a longer plan than any individual transaction suggested. She also knew, from a conversation she'd had with Ruth Albright 3 weeks ago, that Crow had been interested in the Whitlock property specifically and repeatedly. Not the whole ranch, just the south pasture, which was an odd thing to be persistent about. "Why the south pasture?" she had asked Ruth, almost casually. Ruth had given her a look that said she appreciated the question. "Water," she'd said. "The south pasture has the only reliable year-round creek on this side of the ridge. Whoever controls that water controls what can be grazed on about 5,000 acres in a dry summer." Evelyn had filed this away and not revisited it until now. After supper, after the children were settled, she found Caleb in the front room with the account books he sometimes worked through in the evenings. The kind of work a man does when he's too tired to do real work and too worried to sit still. "Does Crow have water on his eastern parcels?" she asked. He looked up from the books. "Seasonal creek. Dries up by July most years." "And the South Pasture Creek?" "Runs year-round, comes down off the North Ridge." He looked at her steadily. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about what it means if someone controls the only year-round water source in a 5,000-acre stretch of grazing land." He sat back in his chair. "It means everyone else is negotiating with him in a dry summer." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the table between them made his face look older than it was. Or maybe that was just the expression. "He offered me $300 for the pasture. It's worth 4 times that in good years." "He knows that." "Yes." "So he's offering you a fraction of the value and expecting you to take it." "He's offering me a fraction of the value and expecting me to need it enough to take it." He looked at the account books. "Which is not an unreasonable calculation. given the last 2 years. She looked at the books too, though she couldn't read them from where she stood. She had a general sense, from the conversations she'd overheard and the ones she'd been part of what 2 hard winters and a sick child and the loss of the woman who had managed the household accounts had done to the ranch's position. It wasn't ruin, but it was the kind of fragility that a man like Crow would read at a glance. "Has he done this before?" she asked. "To someone else here?" "The Hendersons." Caleb said it flatly. "They sold him their east pasture 3 years before they sold him everything. By the time they needed to sell everything, they had no leverage." She stood there in the lamp-lit room and thought about that. "Don't sell the south pasture," she said. "I wasn't planning to." "I know, but I'm saying it clearly because I think this is going to come back. I don't think he came out here to make one offer and accept a polite delay." She looked at him. "Men like that don't make one offer." Caleb met her eyes. "No," he said. "They don't." The second offer came 11 days later, and it was not delivered by Crow himself. It came through Douglas Hale, which told Evelyn something she stored without comment, that Hale and Crow had an arrangement she hadn't known about, that Hale's interest in Caleb's property and Crow's interest in Caleb's property were connected, that the conversation at the Garrett social had not been the random unpleasantness of a difficult man, but the preliminary assessment of someone gathering information. Hale rode up on a Thursday afternoon when Caleb was in the far south pasture and Evelyn was the only adult in the house. He came to the door and knocked with the self-assurance of a man who expected the door to be opened by someone without authority to do anything consequential. Evelyn opened the door. He looked at her with the brief recalibration of a man adjusting his expectations. He stopped. "Miss Whitmore. Mr. Hale. Is Caleb in?" "He's working. I can take a message." He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating eyes of a man deciding whether this was worth his time. "I have an offer for him from a business associate regarding the south pasture." "You can leave the terms with me," she said. "I'll see he gets them. It's a financial matter. I'd rather speak to him directly." "Then come back when he's available." She said it pleasantly. "Or write it down. Either works." He looked at her with the compressed irritation of a man who did not enjoy being managed by women, particularly women he had categorized as not worth managing. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "The offer's in there," he said. $420, cash money, within the week." She took the paper. "I'll give it to him." Hale looked at her steadily for a moment. "Tell him it's a good offer and it won't stay on the table indefinitely." "I'll tell him what you said," she said. "Good afternoon." She closed the door. She stood in the hallway with the paper in her hand and looked at the blank outside of it, and she felt something she recognized. The specific clarity that came when a situation stopped being ambiguous and became a problem she could actually work on. She opened the paper. The offer was indeed $420. It was also, she noticed after reading it twice, structured as a purchase of water rights rather than land. A distinction that would not have been immediately obvious to a man reading it quickly, but that made a significant legal difference in what was actually being transferred. She read it a third time to be certain she was right. She was right. Instead, she had the paper on the kitchen table and was working through the language of it when Clara came in from her afternoon reading and stopped at the sight of Evelyn's face. "What is it?" Clara said. "A legal document, sort of?" Evelyn looked up. "Do you know where your father keeps the papers for the ranch? The deed? The original filing records?" Clara looked at the paper on the table. "The tin box. In his bedroom, on the high shelf." "Can you get it?" Clara went without asking more questions, which Evelyn appreciated. She came back 2 minutes later with a battered tin box that had the weight of something that hadn't been opened recently. It had a simple latch, no lock. Evelyn opened it. The deed was on top. She set it aside for the moment. Beneath it were several years of tax records, a letter from a bank in Helena, what looked like a survey map folded carefully, and at the bottom, a packet of papers tied with a string that had darkened with age. She took out the survey map and unfolded it on the table next to Hale's offer. The survey was dated 1876. Margaret's handwriting was on the outside. Survey, April 1876. The the same careful script she'd seen on the notes Margaret had kept in the household accounts. The map showed the ranch boundaries and, in one corner, a notation in a different hand, the surveyor's, that marked the South Pasture Creek as perennial watercourse, boundary feature, eastern property line. Boundary feature. She looked at Hale's offer again. The language referred to water access rights to the seasonal creek running through the south section. Seasonal. They had called it seasonal. The survey said perennial, year-round. The change of one word in the legal description would change what rights were being sold. It would also, in a contract dispute, be used to argue that the seller had misrepresented the resource, which could be used in turn to challenge the original sale and potentially the property boundary itself. She sat with this for a long moment. "What's wrong with it?" Clara asked. She had stayed sitting at the other end of the table and had been watching Evelyn work through the papers with the stillness of someone who understood that something was happening and was trying to learn the shape of it. "They changed a word," Evelyn said. "One word, between what the survey says about the creek and what this offer calls the creek." Clara looked at the papers. "What word?" "The creek runs year-round. The offer calls it seasonal. A seasonal water source is worth a fraction of a perennial one. If your father signed this without noticing the difference, he'd be selling something much more valuable than what the contract admits to." She paused. "And if someone later wanted to argue the contract, they could use the discrepancy to make it look like the seller, your father, misrepresented the property." Clara was very still. "He could lose more than the pasture." "Potentially, depending on how it was argued and who was doing the arguing." They looked at each other across the table, across the papers and the survey and the open tin box, and Evelyn saw in Clara's face the exact moment when the girl understood what kind of people they were dealing with. "Pa doesn't read contracts very closely," Clara said. It was not a criticism. It was something she said with the resigned knowledge of a daughter who had spent years understanding her father's capacities and limits. "He reads people, he's good at people, but documents—" She shook her head. "I know," Evelyn said. "Mama did the contracts. She did all the paperwork." Clara looked at the tin box. "She kept everything. She was particular about records." "I can see that." Evelyn looked at the survey in Margaret Whitlock's handwriting. She was right to be. When Caleb came in at dusk, mud-booted and tired in the way a man is tired at the end of a day of physical work, Evelyn had the papers laid out on the kitchen table in an order that made sense. Clara was still sitting there. She had not left. He looked at the table, then at Evelyn, then at Clara. "What's this?" he said. "Sit down," Evelyn said. "I need to show you something." She walked him through it. She did it carefully, without rushing it, without editorializing. Just the facts in order, the offer, the word, the survey, what the discrepancy meant legally and practically. She had learned from 6 years of teaching that the way you delivered information determined whether it was received or rejected, and she had also learned that men who were being told something that threatened something they cared about needed the information in a particular sequence: what the problem was, how it had been found, what it meant, and what could be done. He listened without speaking. His face went through several things, and he controlled them all, which she recognized as a practiced skill. A man who had learned to manage his reactions in front of his children. When she finished, there was a silence. "Hale brought this," he said. "Yes." "Hale works for Crow." "That's what I believe, yes." He looked at the survey, at the handwriting on the outside. His jaw worked briefly. "Margaret marked that. I know. She was particular about the water rights. When we filed, she said the water was the thing, that whoever controlled the water controlled everything out here, and she made them note it precisely in the survey." He stopped, picked up the survey and looked at it. Not the map, just the outside, at her handwriting. "She did all of it. I didn't pay as much attention as I should have to how she did it." "She paid enough attention for both of you," Evelyn said, "and it's still paying off." He set the survey down, looked at Hale's offer. "If I'd signed this—" "Don't think about that. You didn't. But if I had—" "Caleb." She said his name without planning to. It was the first time she'd used it directly, not as Mr. Whitlock, not as the careful distance she'd maintained, and it landed with a small weight between them. You didn't, and now you know what they're trying to do. That's what matters. He looked at her. Something moved in his expression, complex and brief. What do I do? He said, not helplessly, as a genuine question directed at someone he believed would have a useful answer. Don't respond to Hale directly. Don't tell him you've read it carefully or that you've found the problem. If they know you know, they'll find another approach. She thought for a moment. Is there a lawyer in town? Someone who handles land matters? Parsons, in Millhaven. He did the original filing. Go see him. Not urgently. Don't ride in tomorrow like the house is on fire. Go in the normal course of business in a few days and take these documents. Have him look at them and write his opinion of the water rights down. Get it on paper. And then? And then you have legal documentation that says the creek is perennial and the boundary feature belongs to this property, and you have a lawyer's signed opinion that says so, which makes Hale's offer, if anyone ever looks at it, look like what it is. Caleb sat with this. He looked at the papers. He looked at the tin box. He looked at Clara, who was sitting at the end of the table with her hands folded and her face doing the thing it did when she was absorbing something and deciding what to do with it. How do you know about contracts? He said to Evelyn. My father was a clerk in a lawyer's office. I grew up reading documents the way other children read stories. She paused. And I had 6 years of dealing with a school board, which is roughly the same kind of education. He almost smiled. Almost. It got most of the way there and then stopped, but the attempt was visible. All right, he said. I'll go see Parsons. Check. He went on a Friday, which was the natural day for a rancher to go into Millhaven for supplies, and he came back in the late afternoon with flour and lamp oil and a written opinion from the lawyer in Helena-bound legal language that said, in its practical core, that the South Pasture Creek was a perennial watercourse constituting a boundary feature of the Whitlock property, and that any transfer of water rights from that source would require specific and accurate legal description that did not exist in the current offer. He put the lawyer's letter in the tin box next to Margaret's survey. He didn't say anything about it at supper. Evelyn didn't either, but after the children were in bed, she was in the kitchen doing the dishes, a task she had claimed not because it was assigned to her, but because it was meditative, and she had found that she needed meditative tasks more since Crow had arrived in the yard. And Caleb came in and picked up the drying cloth and started drying. They worked in silence for a while. Parsons says Crow has done this before, Caleb said. Not here. Other counties. He finds properties with something valuable and makes offers with just enough wrong in the language that most people don't catch it. Then when they can't pay a debt or need money quickly, he comes back with a different angle. He put a plate on the shelf. Parsons called it predatory acquisition, said it was legal until it wasn't, and by then most people had already lost what mattered. How many properties? He knows of 4, probably more he doesn't know about. Caleb dried a cup with more care than it needed. This man has been planning for a long time. Evelyn handed him the next cup. He didn't plan on the survey. No. A pause. He didn't plan on you finding it either. She kept her hands in the water. He didn't plan on Margaret keeping good records. Caleb went still for a moment beside her, then went on drying. No, he said quietly. He didn't. Crow came himself 10 days later. She had been half expecting it, the direct visit after the proxy had not delivered. It was a pattern. First the pleasant offer, then the representative, then the man himself when the other approaches had not closed the deal. She had seen a version of it with the school board, though the stakes had been considerably lower and the man had been smaller in every sense. Crow came in the late morning when Caleb was in the house. She had noticed him timing it, waiting until the wagon was in the yard, which meant he had been watching the property. He came alone this time without the driver, and he walked across the yard with the unhurried ease of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. Caleb met him outside. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window where she was standing in the position she had used since Crow's first visit, not hiding, not pressing herself against the wall, just positioned where she could see without being the focus. The conversation lasted longer this time. She could read some of it from the body language. Crow was expansive, then precise, then more careful, and Caleb was very still in the way he got when he was being exact about something. At one point, Crow looked toward the house, directly at the kitchen window, and she kept her position and her face neutral. He knew she was there. He had been told about her. She was certain of that. He was a man who gathered information. When Caleb came back inside, Clara and Benjamin were at the table and Lily was on the floor with her doll, and all of them had gone quiet the way they did when they understood something significant was happening, even if they didn't have all the information. "He came to raise the offer," Caleb said. He was talking to Evelyn, but not specifically away from the children. $500 now. He's also offering to clear 2 seasons of debt on the north fence repairs as an additional consideration. Benjamin looked up from his arithmetic. "That's a lot of money," Clara said carefully. "It's more than he offered before," Caleb said. "It's still not what the water rights are worth. Parsons put the real value at $2,000 minimum if water prices keep going the way they're going." He paused. "I told him no," Clara exhaled. "He didn't take it well," Caleb continued. "He was pleasant about it, which is worse." He looked at Evelyn. "He said he'd have to look at other options if we couldn't come to an agreement." "He said that precisely?" Evelyn asked. "Precisely." She thought about what other options meant to a man like Crow. "Did he say what options?" "He said he had some questions about the original land filing, that he'd discovered there might be some irregularities in the boundary survey." Caleb's voice was very even. "That he'd hate to see a dispute complicate things for us." The kitchen was quiet. "He's going to challenge the survey," Evelyn said, "or threaten to. Whether the challenge has any merit." "It doesn't. Parsons said the filing was clean." She looked at the tin box, which had been moved to the shelf in the kitchen at her suggestion. Close to hand, not where anyone would look, but where she could reach it quickly. "But a legal challenge doesn't have to have merit to be expensive." "No," Caleb said, "it doesn't." Benjamin had put down his pencil. He was listening with the focused attention he brought to the strategy discussion she'd described from Gettysburg, and she recognized the look, a child understanding that a real situation had a structure and trying to read it. "What are we going to do?" he said. Caleb looked at his son, 9 years old, thin from his illness, holding his pencil and looking at his father with the unguarded directness of a child who had decided to treat this as a question that deserved a real answer. "We're going to be careful," Caleb said. "And we're going to be smarter than he thinks we are." Benjamin nodded, like that was the expected answer, and he was satisfied with it. Clara looked at Evelyn across the table, not with a question exactly, with something closer to recognition, the particular look of a 12-year-old who has begun to understand that the woman at the other end of the table is involved in this in a way that matters. Evelyn held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the tin box on the shelf. They were going to need everything Margaret had kept, every record, every note, every carefully filed document with its precise language and its dated signatures. That evening, she asked Caleb if she could go through the rest of the tin box contents, all of them. He looked at her for a moment. Why? Because Margaret kept records the way a careful person keeps records, which means there might be more in there than what we've looked at. She paused. "And I want to know everything we have before Crow figures out what he's up against." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You think he doesn't know yet?" "I think he thinks he's dealing with a tired rancher who got lucky that his wife kept a good survey on file. I'd like him to keep thinking that for as long as possible." Caleb took the tin box off the shelf and put it on the table in front of her. "Take your time," he said. She did. She worked through the contents until the lamp oil was low, with the house quiet around her and the March wind doing its usual business at the windows. Clara came out once, past 10, which was later than she should have been up, and sat down across from her without asking, and began organizing the papers Evelyn had already gone through into a separate neat pile. They worked without speaking for almost an hour. Near the bottom of the box, beneath a folded letter from Margaret's mother that Evelyn set carefully aside without reading, there was a small envelope with water. Original agreement, 1874, written on the outside in Margaret's hand. Evelyn opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten, dated March of 1874, bearing the signatures of 2 men, The first was a name she didn't recognize. The second was Silas Crow. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, very slowly, because the third reading confirmed what the second had suggested, and she wanted to be certain before she said anything. "Clara," she said. Clara looked up from her organizing. "Go get your father," Evelyn said. "Please." Clara read her face. She didn't ask questions. She got up and went down the hall, and Evelyn heard the low knock on Caleb's door and his voice, rough with interrupted sleep, and then his footsteps. He came into the kitchen in his work clothes, pulling his suspenders up, and he looked at her face the same way Clara had. She put the paper on the table in front of him. "Your wife wasn't just keeping records of what belonged to you," she said. "She was keeping a record of what Crow did to the people who owned this land before you." He looked at the paper, then at her. "What is this?" "An agreement," Evelyn said, "dated 1874. The original settlers on this land, the ones you bought the ranch from, they made an arrangement with Crow about the south pasture water. He paid them to share access in dry summers." She kept her voice steady. "And then, according to the letter that was filed with this in 1875, she put the second paper beside the first. He stopped paying, claimed the agreement had expired, and when they contested it, he filed a legal complaint that tied up their ability to sell the property for 2 years. Caleb looked at the papers. "They couldn't sell because of the complaint," he said slowly. "So they sold cheap to get out from under it." "Yes." "And who did they sell to?" "A land broker, who sold it 6 months later to you." She watched him understand it. "Margaret must have found this in the original property records when you bought the ranch. She kept it. She knew what it meant, even if she didn't know exactly when it would matter." The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb put his hand flat on the table, on top of the 2 papers, not gripping them, just the flat weight of his palm. He looked at nothing in particular for a moment. "She knew," he said. "She kept this because she knew this day would come." Evelyn did not say anything. Sometimes a man needed to say a thing like that without it being answered. He stood like that for a moment longer. Then he picked up both papers and held them carefully, the way you hold something you understand the value of. "In the morning," he said, "I'm going to Parsons." "Take copies," Evelyn said. "Leave the originals here. Don't take the originals anywhere." He nodded. He looked at her over the papers. "She would have liked you," he said, simply, without decoration. Evelyn looked at the table, at the tin box, at the organized papers Clara had stacked, at the small envelope with Margaret's handwriting on the outside. She didn't say anything for a moment. "Get some sleep," she said finally. "You've got an early ride." He went back to his room. Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and the papers in their careful order, and she thought about a woman who had seen trouble coming from a long way off and had quietly made certain that when it arrived, there would be something there to meet it. Outside, the March wind had turned. It was coming from the west now, warmer, carrying the smell of something other than frozen ground. Spring was not here yet, but it was coming. Parsons sent word back within 3 days, which was fast for a lawyer, which meant he understood what he was looking at. The message came by Ryder, a boy from Millhaven who handed the sealed envelope to Caleb in the yard and waited long enough to confirm it had been received, then turned his horse around without ceremony. Caleb brought the envelope inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened it with the deliberateness of a man who has learned not to let his hands show what he's feeling. Evelyn was at the stove. She didn't turn around until she heard him set the letter down. His face was careful in the way it got when the information was significant, and he was deciding how to hold it. "Parsons says the 1874 document is valid," he said. "He says it establishes a pattern of conduct. That Crow used the same approach on the Henderson property that he used on the original settlers. First an access agreement, then a dispute, then a legal complication that made the property unsellable until the owners were desperate." He paused. "He says if there are other properties where the same thing happened, the territorial court in Helena would have grounds for a fraud investigation." Evelyn turned from the stove. "How many other properties does he think there are?" "He doesn't know. He says he's heard things over the years, but nothing with documentation." Caleb looked at the letter. "He wants to know if we're willing to bring this to the territorial court." The kitchen was quiet. Benjamin was in the other room, Chick. She could hear him at his arithmetic. And Clara was outside on some errand, and Lily was asleep in the afternoon nap she still took at 5, and it was just the two of them at the table with the letter between them and the sound of the stove doing its work. "What does bringing it to the territorial court mean?" Evelyn asked. "Practically. It means Crow finds out we have it. It means he knows we're not just refusing his offer. We're coming at him with something." He set the letter flat on the table. "It means this doesn't stay quiet." "It was never going to stay quiet," she said. He looked at her. "He's going to keep coming," she said. "You know that. Another offer, another proxy, another approach. He's been working this kind of plan for years, and he doesn't stop because someone says no politely. The only thing that stops a man like that is something that costs him more than the prize is worth." She paused. "Right now the prize is the South Pasture, but it's not really the South Pasture. It's the water. And the water gives him leverage over every rancher on this side of the ridge for the next 30 years. Caleb sat back. "If we go to the territorial court and we lose, what does Parsons say about losing?" "He says the document is strong. He says the pattern of conduct makes a compelling case. He says he can't guarantee anything because nothing in territorial court is guaranteed, but he thinks a judge would take it seriously." He looked at the ceiling briefly, the look of a man running calculations. "He also says Crow has money for lawyers, real lawyers, Helena lawyers. Parsons is a real lawyer. Parsons handles wills and fence disputes and the occasional horse theft." He said it without disparagement, just factually. "Crow will bring in someone from back east." Evelyn thought about this. "Then we need more than one property on record. If it's just us, it looks like a dispute between neighbors. If there are 3 properties with the same pattern, the same language in the access agreements, the same kind of legal complication appearing right when the owners needed to sell, it stops being a dispute and starts being something a judge can see from across a room." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The Hendersons left," he said. "Went to Oregon. I don't know if they'd come back for this. Do you have an address for them?" "Margaret might." He looked at the tin box, which had become a permanent fixture on the kitchen shelf. "She kept up with most people who left." "Look." He looked. There were 3 letters from a Mrs. Henderson. She had written Margaret in the first year after they left, and Margaret had kept the letters with the return address on the outside in her own hand, the way people did when they understood that addresses were information worth preserving. Oregon City. A street name. A family that had been run off land they'd held for 8 years and had spent 3 years since, by the distance and the silence of their letters, trying to forget it. "Write to them," Evelyn said. "They might not want to be involved." "They might not, but they deserve to know that the same thing he did to them, he's been doing to others, and that there's documentation now." She looked at him steadily. "Let them decide." Caleb wrote the letter that evening. He wrote it the way he did most things, directly, without ornamentation, just the facts in order and what he was asking and why. He read it to Evelyn before he sealed it, which she understood as a request for an opinion, even though he didn't frame it as one. "It's good," she said. "Don't change it." He sealed it and set it with the outgoing mail for the next Millhaven run. That night, for the first time since the morning after she'd found the 1874 document, Evelyn slept without lying awake running the problem in circles. She didn't know if this was because the situation had improved or because she had simply exhausted the available worrying, but either way, she slept and woke up to gray morning light and the sound of Lily singing to her doll in the next room, something tuneless and contented, the private music of a small child who doesn't know anyone can hear her. She lay still for a moment and listened to it. Then she got up and started the day. The trouble, when it came, did not come from Crow directly. It came from the north fence line on a Tuesday in late March, in the form of 3 of Caleb's cattle found on Hale's property. Not strayed through a gap, but with the fence cut clean, 2 posts pulled and set aside in a way that was too deliberate for accident and not deliberate enough to be obvious at a quick look. Caleb found it at first light and came back to the house with his jaw set in the way it got when he was angry and was managing it carefully. "Hale's going to say my cattle trespassed," he said. "He's going to want payment for the grazing, or he's going to take one of the cattle in compensation before I can stop him. Have you seen him? Not yet. His man saw me pulling the cattle back. He'll have reported it by now. Evelyn looked out the window at the yard. Clear morning, cold still, but not biting the way February had bitten. Did you document the fence? He looked at her. The way the posts were pulled, she said. Did you look at it carefully enough to describe it? I've been cutting fence and setting fence for 20 years. I know what a downed fence looks like versus a cut one. Can you write down what you saw, today, while it's fresh? The specific details of how the posts were pulled, the direction the wire was cut, whether there was mud on the wire ends that suggested Evelyn. He said her name with something between exasperation and the edge of being impressed. I'm a rancher, not a court reporter. You're a rancher who is going to be in front of a territorial court judge in the next few months. Start thinking like both. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a long moment. Fine, he said. I'll write it down. He wrote it down. 3 paragraphs, blunt and detailed, with the fence cutting described in terms that were specific enough to establish it was not an accident and precise enough that a person who knew nothing about fence would still understand what the difference was. Evelyn read it and told him it was good, and they put it in the tin box next to Margaret's documents. Hale came that afternoon. He came with his man, a large, quiet person who stood slightly behind and to the right of him in the way of a man whose job was to make the person in front seem more substantial. Hale himself came to the door and knocked, and when Caleb opened it, he had on his face the expression of a man performing reasonableness. Your cattle were on my land this morning, Hale said. My cattle went through a cut fence, Caleb said. I've documented the cut. If you want to discuss it, come in. Hale looked past Caleb into the hallway. Evelyn was at the kitchen table and she knew he could see her and she did not move. He came in. They sat at the kitchen table, Caleb, Hale, and Evelyn, with Hale's man staying in the hallway, which was an interesting choice that suggested Hale wasn't as comfortable as he was performing. Claire had taken Benjamin and Lily outside at Evelyn's suggestion, given before Hale arrived, worded as a request for air and exercise and understood by Clara immediately as something else. Hale made his argument about the cattle. He was measured and civil about it in the way of a man who wanted it recorded, if anyone ever asked, that he had been measured and civil. He believed the cattle had trespassed. He was owed compensation. He was willing to be reasonable about the terms. Caleb put the written description of the fence on the table. The fence was cut, he said. I've documented the specifics. This is dated today before your visit. He looked at Hale without particular heat. If your property was damaged by my cattle while they were through a cut fence on your side, that's something we can discuss. But trespass requires the cattle to have crossed on their own, and I don't believe that's what happened here. Hale looked at the paper, not with surprise exactly, more with the recalibration of a man who has run an operation for several years and encountered an unexpected variable. He looked at Evelyn. You've been busy, he said to her directly. I've been teaching, she said. Children learn better when the people around them take documentation seriously. Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, something more considered than that. He looked back at Caleb. Mr. Whitlock, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. You cut my fence and moved my cattle onto your property, Caleb said. That was the complicated part. The rest is just paperwork. Hale sat with that for a moment. Then he stood up. Mr. Crow is a patient man, he said pleasantly, to the middle distance. But patience has a natural end. So does patience, Caleb said. On our end, too. Hale left. His man followed. They watched from the window as the horses went down the track, and when they were gone, Caleb turned from the window and rubbed the back of his neck and let out a breath that carried about 3 weeks of contained tension in it. He's not going to stop, he said. No, Evelyn said. He's going to escalate. What's the next move? She had been thinking about this since the fence. He's been working gradually. Offers, then pressure, then this. He's testing how much each step costs him before he takes the next one. The fence cutting was low risk for him. It could have been an accident. It's deniable. She looked at the table. The next step won't be deniable. What does that mean? It means we need to move faster than he expects. She looked up at him. Parsons needs to file with the territorial court before Crow does anything that requires us to be on the defensive. If we're the ones who brought the fraud complaint, we control the timing. If we're responding to something he does, we're behind. Caleb thought about this. Parsons said he'd need another 2 weeks to prepare the filing. Tell him one. Evelyn, tell him 1 week and tell him why. He knows what Crow does when people take too long. Caleb looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as the one he got when she had said something he was going to do, and hadn't entirely caught up to yet. All right, he said. I'll ride in tomorrow. But he didn't ride in tomorrow because that night the weather turned. It came fast, the way late March storms came in Montana, without the long buildup of winter weather, just a shift in the pressure that anyone who had lived here more than one season could feel in the air in the late afternoon, a heaviness that meant business. By dark, it was snowing. By midnight, it was a full storm, the kind that made the windows flex and put 2 inches of new snow against the door by morning. It lasted 4 days. 4 days of enforced proximity, and children who had already used up most of their indoor patience in February, and Caleb doing what he could to check the animals between gusts, coming in cold and wet and going out again, and Evelyn holding the household together by sheer organizational will and the accumulated knowledge of what this family needed and in what order. On the second day, Benjamin developed a cough again. Not the serious chest cough of winter, just the kind a person gets when they're cooped up and the air is dry. But it was enough to make everyone in the house go careful and watchful in a way they hadn't since January. That particular collective holding of breath that a family does when someone has been sick before and might be sick again. She made him a steam tent with a blanket and a bowl of hot water and sat with him while he breathed it, and he complained about it in the specific bored way of a child who is not seriously ill but is inconvenienced, which was reassuring. "This is terrible," he said from under the blanket. "It's helping." "How can you tell?" "Because you're complaining instead of sleeping." He was quiet for a moment. Then from under the blanket, "Is Pa going to be okay with Crow?" She looked at the shape of him under the blanket. "Where did that come from?" "I've been thinking about it. During the storm." The blanket moved slightly as he shifted. "I understand the strategy now. What Crow is trying to do. He's trying to make everything cost more than it's worth, so Pa gives up." "That's right," she said. "But we have the documents." "We have the documents. So we're ahead. We're ahead in the information. We're not ahead in the resources. Crow has more money for lawyers and more time." She said this carefully, because Benjamin had demonstrated consistently that he handled honest information better than managed information, and treating him like a child who needed things softened had never served him. But being ahead in the information is not nothing. It's significant. Courts care about evidence. The blanket moved again. He emerged from it slightly, just his face, red-cheeked from the steam. "Evelyn." "Yes." "Are you going to stay?" The question landed with the particular weight of a question that has been building for a while before it came out. He was looking at her with his fever-bright eyes and his steam-flushed face and the directness of a child who had decided that the only adults worth talking to were the ones who told you the truth. She looked at him for a moment. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's an honest answer." He seemed to think about whether he accepted this. "Do you want to?" She looked at the bowl of steaming water. "That's a more complicated question." "Why?" "Because wanting something and it being the right thing aren't always the same question." He considered this. "Mama used to say that too. Not those exact words, but that same thing." He pulled the blanket back over his face, but not before she saw the expression on it, which was the expression of a child filing something important. "I think you want to," he said from under the blanket. She put her hand briefly on the top of his blanket-covered head and went back to the kitchen without saying anything else. The storm broke on the 4th day, clearing overnight into one of those sharp, brilliant mornings that came after Montana storms like an apology. Sky an impossible blue, snow on everything making the world look new and slightly too bright to look at directly. Caleb was out before first light to check the animals. Evelyn had coffee ready when he came back, and he sat down and drank it in the silence of a man running an inventory of what the storm had and hadn't cost him. "North fence is down again," he said. "Different section this time." She looked at him over her cup. "Weather could have done it," he said. It's an old section, but the way it went down. He shook his head. Same as before? Similar. Can't be certain in all that snow. He looked at his coffee. I'm going to Mill Haven today. The roads will be passable by mid-morning. Tell Parsons 1 week? I'll tell him 1 week. He paused. I'm also going to ask him about the other ranchers on this side of the ridge, the ones with the seasonal water problems in dry summers. If Crow's been pressuring me, he's been working on them too, even if they don't know what to call it yet. She looked at him. You said if we can show a pattern across multiple properties, it changes the case, he said. I've been thinking about that. I know every rancher within 20 miles. I can talk to them in a way Parsons can't. That's good, she said. That's very good. He looked slightly surprised by this, which told her he'd expected pushback or redirection rather than agreement, which in turn told her something about what he was used to. You think it'll work? I think it's the right approach. You have relationships Parsons doesn't. People will tell you things they won't put in a legal statement, and from that you can figure out who actually has documentation and who's just got a feeling. She paused. Start with the ranchers who sold, not the ones who are still here, the ones who left. They have less to lose and more reason to be angry. He nodded once, the slow, certain nod of a man who had made a decision and stopped second-guessing it. He left after breakfast. Clara saw him go from the window and came to stand beside Evelyn in the way she did now, not requiring anything, just present. A 12-year-old who had developed the habit of proximity to this woman in the kitchen as a way of being near whatever was happening. He looked different this morning, Clara said. Different how? Clara thought about it. Less like he's waiting for something bad to happen, more like he's deciding to do something about it. She paused. He used to look like that before Mama got sick. I forgot what it looked like. Evelyn said nothing. She looked out the window at the track where his horse had gone, the hoofprints already beginning to soften in the bright mid-morning sun. What? He came back with 3 things. Parsons's agreement to file within the week, the name of a rancher named Cole Briggs, who had sold his eastern pasture to Crow 2 years ago, under circumstances he'd never been comfortable with, and a look on his face that Evelyn hadn't seen before, something that was past the careful management, past the controlled expressions, something more direct. He told her about Parsons and Briggs at the supper table, with the children present, which was itself a change. He had been keeping the Crow business adult level until now, and the shift to including the children in the update meant he had decided something about how this family operated and who was included in it. Clara listened with her arms folded but her eyes working, the way she processed things. Benjamin listened with his elbows on the table, which normally got him corrected and tonight did not. Lily listened to the tone rather than the content, as she usually did, and determined from the tone that things were going in a direction that was okay, and went back to her supper. After the children were in bed, Caleb stayed at the table. Evelyn was doing the dishes, and he sat in the chair at the head of the table with his hands on the wood and said, without particular preamble, Briggs said Crow told him he had no legal choice, that the original survey on his property had an error that gave Crow a claim to the access road. He paused. There was no error. Briggs just didn't know enough to know there wasn't one, and Crow had a lawyer tell him there was, and Briggs couldn't afford to fight it. So he sold. He sold for half what the pasture was worth. He's been angry about it for 2 years, and he didn't know there was anything to be done. Caleb looked at his hands. He'll give a statement, written, signed, whatever Parsons needs. That's 2 properties with documented patterns, Evelyn said. Yours and his. Parsons thinks if we go to Helena with 3, the territorial judge will open a formal investigation. Not just rule on our specific complaint, actually investigate Crow's land dealings in this territory going back 10 years. She turned from the sink. That's significant. Yes, he paused. The Hendersons. Did we hear back? Not yet. The letter's only been out 2 weeks. Oregon City is a long way. If we don't hear in time, there are other properties. You said Crow's been buying land for 10 years. That's 10 years of people he pressured or misled or outright defrauded. Briggs is one. The Hendersons would be another. There will be more. She looked at him steadily. We find one more before Parsons files. That might not be easy. No, she agreed. It won't be. He sat for a while longer. The house was quiet around them, the quiet of children sleeping, which was a different quality of quiet than the quiet of an empty house. Thicker somehow, more purposeful. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. He looked at the table for a moment, at his hands on the wood. "The roads are going to be fully open in 2, maybe 3 weeks." He said it without looking up. "You've been here since January. You had an arrangement, room and board for teaching, until the roads opened." She held the dish towel in her hands and said nothing. "The arrangement was... It made sense at the time, when I made it." He looked up. His face was doing the careful management thing, but less successfully than usual. "It doesn't describe what's actually happened, what you've done here." "I've done what needed doing," she said. "You've done considerably more than that." He said it plainly, without decoration. "You found those documents. You understood what they meant. You told me how to respond to Crow before I would have figured it out on my own, which might have been too late." He paused. "You taught my children. You..." The shelf, the doll, the way Benjamin talks about things now. He stopped, seemed to look for something. "He told me last week that you have to know what you don't know." He said it like it was something new he'd figured out. He did figure it out. He figured it out because of you. Caleb looked at her directly, the winter gray eyes without their management. "The roads are going to open, and I don't want you to go." The kitchen was very quiet. She held the dish towel. "That's not a..." He stopped. Started again. "I'm not saying that because I need a teacher for the children. I'm not saying it because of Crow or the documents, or because you're useful in a crisis." He looked frustrated with himself, the specific frustration of a man who communicates in function and practicality and is attempting something that doesn't fit those categories. "I'm saying it because this house has been... It's been more like itself since you came, and I didn't expect that, and I don't know what to do with it." Evelyn put the dish towel down on the counter. She thought about the morning after she arrived, standing on the porch with her brown coat and her carefully pinned hair and the look on his face that she had described to herself as the look of a man who had made a bad investment. She thought about the narrow bed and the 10 minutes she had given herself and the primer she had taken to Benjamin's room that first night because there was nothing else to do with herself. She thought about Clara with the photograph in the lamplight, Lily and the button, Benjamin's face from under the steam blanket. She thought about the survey in Margaret's handwriting and the 1874 document at the bottom of the tin box, and the way a woman she had never met had kept every record with the careful precision of someone building a defense against something she could see coming, but couldn't stop alone. "I'm not easy to have in a house," she said. "I'm opinionated, and I take over things I think could be done better, and I have strong feelings about documentation." I noticed. "I wasn't made for quiet arrangements. I'm not going to sit in a corner and be grateful. I know that. And I can't." She stopped, looked at the tin box on the shelf. "I can't give you more children. That doesn't change. That will never change." "I know that too," he said. "I've had time to think about what I actually need versus what I thought I needed in January." He paused. "They're not the same list." She looked at him. He was not a smooth man. He was a man with mud still on his boots from checking the north fence, and a face that showed too much when he stopped managing it, and hands that knew how to fix things, and a habit of leaving coffee made that had started somewhere in the second week and never stopped. He was a man who had gone into his son's room 3 times in one night and thought no one knew. She thought about Philadelphia, the boarding house, the school, her sister's face. She thought about the track outside where his horse's hoof prints had softened in the morning sun. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "I'll stay," she said. "If that's what you're asking, that's what I'm asking." She picked up the dish towel and turned back to the sink. "Finish your coffee," she said. "You've got an early ride to Briggs's place tomorrow to ask him about 2 more names." He almost smiled. It was the closest he got to the whole thing, that almost smile. And she didn't turn around to see it, but she heard it somehow, in the small shift in the air of the kitchen. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And then, because the situation was what it was, and neither of them were people who made ceremonies of things, he finished his coffee and she finished the dishes, and they said goodnight at the hallway the way they did every night, And it was both entirely ordinary and nothing like ordinary, and she went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time before she lay down. Outside, the March sky was clear in the way that follows a storm, every star sharp and cold and exactly where it was supposed to be. The tin box was on the kitchen shelf. The survey was inside it. The 1874 document was inside it. Margaret Whitlock's careful handwriting was inside it, still doing its work. The roads would open soon. Evelyn Whitmore was not going to be on them. The letter from the Hendersons arrived 4 days later. It was written in a woman's hand. Mrs. Henderson, Evelyn guessed, from the quality of it, from the care taken with the words, and it was 2 pages long, and it said yes. It said yes to the statement, yes to the documentation, yes to the territorial court. And at the end, in a paragraph that was briefer and more careful than the rest, it said that they had been waiting 2 years to hear that someone had found a way to do something about Silas Crow, and that if Evelyn Whitmore was the one who had found it, they were glad she had been where she was when she found it. Caleb read the letter at the kitchen table with the afternoon light coming through the window, and Clara was there, and Benjamin, and Lily was on the floor with her doll, and when he set the letter down, he looked at Evelyn across the table with an expression that had something in it she did not try to name. 3 properties, she said. 3 properties, he said. She looked at the letter, at Mrs. Henderson's handwriting, at the yes that was going to matter. Send it to Parsons today, she said. He did. Parsons filed with the territorial court on a Thursday in early April, and by Saturday morning the news had done what news did in a small community. Traveled faster than any horse could carry it, arriving at every kitchen table and barn door and general store counter in the county with the particular speed of information that people had been waiting to hear without knowing they were waiting. Evelyn learned this from Mrs. Garrett, who appeared at the ranch door on Saturday afternoon with a pie that was both a pie and a statement. 3 properties, Mrs. Garrett said, sitting at the kitchen table with her coat still on. Parsons told my husband. He said it was the cleanest fraud case he'd put together in 20 years of practice. She looked at Evelyn with the direct assessment she always used. He also said a woman found the key document. The document found itself, Evelyn said. It had been in that tin box for years. Someone had to open the box. Evelyn cut the pie and did not argue the point. Mrs. Garrett stayed for an hour. She talked about the community reaction, which was, as best she could describe it, a complicated mixture of satisfaction and unease. The satisfaction of people who had suspected something wrong for years and were now seeing it named, and the unease of people who understood that naming it would have consequences that had not yet arrived. Crow had money. Crow had lawyers coming from Helena. The territorial court had agreed to open an investigation but had not ruled on anything. The situation was not resolved. It was correctly described. People are watching, Mrs. Garrett said at the door when she left, more than you probably realize. Watching what? Evelyn asked. Mrs. Garrett looked at her steadily. Watching to see what kind of people you are when it gets harder, she said. Because it's going to get harder before it gets settled. She was right. It got harder within the week. Crow's response to the territorial filing was not legal. Not initially. The legal response came later in the form of a Helena lawyer named Whitfield, who sent a letter to Parsons that was 19 pages long and contested every element of the fraud complaint with the kind of exhaustive precision that costs a great deal of money to produce and is designed to make the other side calculate whether they can afford to continue. Parsons wrote back. Whitfield wrote back again. The correspondence became its own kind of weather, arriving regularly, requiring attention, consuming hours that Caleb did not have, and Parsons billed for at rates that were reasonable by Helena standards, and quietly alarming by Millhaven ones. But before the legal letters, there was the fire. It started in the South Barn on a Wednesday night in the 3rd week of April, and Evelyn woke to the smell of it before she heard anything, that particular wrongness in the air that her sleeping mind registered as danger before she was fully conscious enough to name what kind. She was out of bed and in the hallway in seconds, and she could see the orange light through the window at the end of the hall before she'd processed what it meant. And she was banging on Caleb's door and shouting his name, and he was already moving, already awake, the way a man sleeps when he has livestock to protect and has learned to come fully alert at the first signal. They got the horses out. That was the priority, The horses and the two milk cows and the equipment near the main doors, everything that could be led or carried in the time they had, while the south end of the barn took the fire and held it in a way that told her someone who knew barns had set it at the end where the wind would carry it forward into the structure rather than away from it. Clara was there. She had come out without being woken, already pulling the smaller animals, already understanding what needed to happen. Benjamin was at the house door keeping Lily inside, both of his arms around his little sister with a steadiness that was older than 9 years old, and he watched from the doorway with his face doing the thing faces do when a person is frightened and has decided that being frightened is not currently useful. The south barn burned, the north barn held, the house held, the animals were out. The equipment, most of it, was out. Caleb stood in the yard when it was over. In the gray pre-dawn light with ash in his hair and a burn on his left forearm, he hadn't noticed until Evelyn pointed to it, and he looked at what was left of the south barn with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not defeat. Something more specific than defeat. The look of a man confronting the fact that someone hated him enough to do this, and working out what that meant about everything he'd thought he understood. Crow, he said, not as a question. Someone who knows how barns burn, Evelyn said, and when people sleep. I can't prove it. No, not yet. He looked at the burn on his arm as if noticing it for the first time. It was the south barn, the one closest to the south pasture. I know. He's telling me what he wants. He said it flatly, without inflection. And what happens if he doesn't get it? Lily had come out of the house by then, past Benjamin, across the yard, and had attached herself to Caleb's side with both arms the way very small children do when they understand that something frightening has happened, and the frightening thing is over, and now they need to be held. He put his arm around her automatically, still looking at the barn, and she pressed her face against his side and stayed there. Clara came and stood near Evelyn. She smelled of smoke. Her hair was loose, and her face was smudged, and she was 12 years old, and she had done the work of an adult in the last hour without being asked and without flinching. What do we do? She said, to Evelyn specifically, not to her father, to Evelyn, the way she had started asking questions in the months since January when she wanted a particular kind of answer. We document it, Evelyn said, before anything else. She wrote the account herself. That morning, while the ash was still settling, sitting at the kitchen table with Benjamin beside her because he had asked to help, and she had understood that helping was what he needed. She wrote what time she had woken, what she had smelled, what she had seen when she came to the window. She wrote what the fire looked like at what stage, which way the wind was moving, where it had started relative to the structure. She wrote what they had saved, and what they had lost, and in what order events had occurred. She wrote that the fire had started at the south end of the barn, which was the sheltered end, the end where it would have needed to be deliberately positioned to catch and spread the way it did, because a natural fire in a barn in April with no lightning and no lamp left burning does not start at the sheltered end and move efficiently forward. She gave it to Caleb to read, and he read it and added 2 details she hadn't had: the specific condition of the south door latch, which he'd found open and had always kept locked, and the fresh boot marks in the mud east of the structure, prints that were too large to be his and too purposeful to belong to anyone passing through. They sent a copy to Parsons with a note that said to hold it with the other documentation. They kept the original in the tin box, next to Margaret's survey and the 1874 agreement and the Henderson letter. The tin box was getting heavy. Evelyn thought sometimes that this was the real record of what they were doing, not the legal filings, not Parsons' letters to Helena, but this accumulation of paper in a battered tin box, each piece added because one careful person or another had understood that someday someone would need to know exactly what had happened and in what order. Margaret had started it. Evelyn was continuing it. It was, she thought, the most honest kind of record, not built for any particular purpose when it was gathered, just built because precise people understood that truth has a way of needing witnesses, and documents were the most patient kind. The community response to the fire came faster than she expected, and in a form she did not entirely expect. Mrs. Garrett came the next morning with her husband and 2 other ranchers, Men Evelyn recognized from the garret social but had never spoken to at length, and they came with tools and timber and the particular purposeful quiet of people who had already discussed what they were going to do before they arrived and did not need to negotiate it on the doorstep. They were rebuilding the South Barn. It was not a small thing. It was several days of work by several men, and it was offered without ceremony, without requiring gratitude to be performed, in the practical way of a community that understood that what happened to one person's barn was a message to everyone about what could happen to anyone's barn, and that the correct response to that message was not to receive it, but to refuse it. More people came over the following days. Not all of them people Evelyn would have predicted. She recognized two women from the garret social who had been in the fireplace cluster on the day Hale had said his piece. Women who had not been friendly and who came now anyway, with food and with their husbands, and without any acknowledgement that there had been an earlier position from which they were departing. Evelyn accepted the food and did not acknowledge the earlier position either, because that was the right thing to do, and also because she had learned that being right about something was considerably less valuable than being effective, and the two things were not always served by the same behavior. Ruth Albright came with her book collection. All of it. A crate of 30 books that she had carried in her wagon and set on the porch and said simply, "For the children, and for you, if you want them." She had looked at Evelyn with her arithmetic eyes. "I hear you're staying." "I'm staying," Evelyn said. Ruth nodded. "Good." And left. Douglas Hale did not come. His absence was noted by everyone and mentioned by no one, which was its own kind of statement, the community drawing a line around itself in a way that required no words. Bummed. Caleb worked on the barn from first light to last for 4 days running, and on the evening of the 4th day he came inside with the burn on his arm, healing and sawdust in his hair, and a look on his face that was different from the one he'd had standing in the yard watching the fire. It was not a triumphant look. He was not a triumphant man, not given to that register, but it was the look of someone who had come through something and found themselves still standing on the other side of it, and who understood what that meant. He ate supper with the children, and afterward, when Clara had taken Benjamin and Lily for their baths, he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and said, "I need to talk to you about something." She sat down across from him. Whitfield, Crow's lawyer, sent another letter to Parsons. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. He's arguing that the 1874 document is inadmissible because it was acquired from property records during a private transaction and wasn't properly registered with the Territorial Land Office. Is he right? Parsons says no. He says it was part of the original property transfer documentation and is fully admissible, but Whitfield is going to argue it. He paused. He's also questioning the Henderson statement on the grounds that they sold voluntarily and any dispute they had with Crow was settled at the time of sale. They sold because they felt they had no choice. I know that. Parsons knows that. Whitfield is arguing the legal version, not the human version. He looked at his coffee. We need someone who can speak to the human version, in court, in person. The Hendersons. They said yes to a written statement. I don't know if they'll come to Helena for a territorial hearing. He looked at her. I was thinking you should write to Mrs. Henderson, not Parsons, not me. You. She looked at him. Why me? Because you wrote the first letter that got a response. He said it simply. She wrote back to us because of how that letter was written. You wrote half of it. This was true. She had drafted the second page of his letter, the part that had named specifically what had been done to the previous owners and why the documentation mattered. The part that had been written not in the language of legal complaint, but in the language of one person telling another person the truth about a thing that had been done to them both. I'll write to her, Evelyn said. She wrote the letter that night, after the house was quiet. She wrote it at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and the tin box beside her, not because she needed to consult the documents, but because having them there felt right. Because Mrs. Henderson's husband had signed the 1874 agreement, had trusted a man he should not have trusted, had lost something that had taken years to build, and deserved to know that it was going to matter. She told Mrs. Henderson what had happened to the barn. She told her what Whitfield was arguing and why it mattered that someone who had been there, who had lived through what Crow did the first time, could say, in person and under oath, what that had actually been like. She did not ask for anything in the language of a request. She wrote it the way she had written the first letter, in the language of truth about a shared thing, and she told Mrs. Henderson that whatever she decided, the documentation they had already provided had made this case possible, and that meant something regardless of what the court did. She sealed the letter and put it with the outgoing mail, and did not tell herself how it would be answered, because she had learned that the only productive relationship with an uncertain outcome was to do what you could and then wait without suffering too much over the waiting. The territorial hearing in Helena was set for the second week of May. Parsons wrote out personally to tell them. He was not a man who delivered significant news by letter if he could manage otherwise, which Evelyn respected. And he sat at the kitchen table and went through what would happen and in what order, and Clara sat at the other end and listened with the same focused attention she brought to things she had decided mattered, and Benjamin sat beside her, and Lily was on the floor with her doll doing the things she did, where she appeared to be absorbed in her own business but was actually tracking everything that was said. "The judge is a man named Alderman," Parsons said. "He's been on the territorial bench for 11 years. He's not sympathetic to money for its own sake, which works in our favor. He is, however, rigorous about evidence, which means we need everything clean and in order." He looked at the tin box on the shelf. "I'll need the originals in Helena." "I'll bring them," Evelyn said. Parsons looked at her, then at Caleb. "You're both coming?" "Yes," Caleb said. "Good." Parsons looked at the table. "I should tell you. Whitfield is bringing 3 witnesses, men who will testify that Crow's land dealings have been conducted in good faith. 2 are business associates from back east. The third is a surveyor who will argue that the 1874 agreement was a standard access arrangement that expired by its own terms." "Can he argue that?" Clara said, from the end of the table. Parsons looked at her with the brief recalibration of a man who had not expected the question from that direction. "He can argue it. Whether the judge agrees with the argument is different." "What does the document say? About expiration?" Parsons looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Clara. "There's no expiration clause," Evelyn said. "I've read it 4 times. There's no language about the agreement expiring. The surveyor Whitfield brought will have to construct that interpretation from context rather than from the text itself." Clara nodded once, with the satisfied finality of a person who has confirmed what they suspected. Parsons watched her for a moment. "Your daughter has a legal mind," he said to Caleb. "She has her mother's mind," Caleb said. There was a small silence, and then Parsons moved on to the next item, but Evelyn caught Clara's face in the moment between the quick, unguarded expression of a child receiving something she hadn't known she needed, and then the familiar closing of it, the controlled exterior reasserting itself, but not before Evelyn had seen it. "Ma'am, the letter from Mrs. Henderson arrived 5 days before the hearing. She was coming, both of them, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, making the journey from Oregon City, which was not a short journey or a cheap one, and which they were making because, as Mrs. Henderson wrote in her careful hand, they had spent 2 years being angry about something they believed could not be changed, and it turned out it could be changed, and they were not going to sit in Oregon while someone else did the changing. Evelyn read the letter twice and then set it on the table and went outside and stood in the yard for a moment in the early May air, which was finally warm in the way that Montana spring air eventually became warm. Not tentative anymore, not apologizing for itself, just warm, with the smell of the thawed ground and something green beginning underneath it. She stood there until she had herself collected, and then went back inside. They rode to Millhaven and took the stage to Helena, she and Caleb and Parsons, leaving the children with Mrs. Garrett, who had offered without being asked and had included in the offer the information that she would keep them busy enough that they wouldn't have time to worry, which was the right instinct, and Evelyn appreciated it. Clara had not argued about staying. She had said, the morning they left, standing in the yard with her arms not crossed for once, "Bring back something good." Not as a demand. As a statement of what she was expecting, which was both an expression of confidence and the most Clara had ever allowed herself to sound like a child who needed reassurance. "We'll try," Caleb said. "Don't try," Clara said. "Just do it." He looked at his daughter. The expression on his face was complicated and clear at the same time. The face of a man seeing exactly who his child was and being overwhelmed by it in a way he was not going to show directly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Clara had almost smiled. Almost. What? Helena was larger than Millhaven, the way a river is larger than a creek, obviously, categorically, in every direction. The territorial court building was a serious structure, the kind built to suggest that what happened inside it was permanent, and walking into it with the tin box under her arm and Parsons beside her and Caleb just behind, Evelyn felt the full weight of what the last 4 months had been building toward. The Hendersons were already there. Mrs. Henderson was a small, contained woman in her 50s, with the look of someone who had done a great deal of difficult work and not been weakened by it. She saw Evelyn across the entrance hall and came directly, with the purposeful stride of a woman who had made a decision and was not reconsidering it. "Miss Whitmore," she said. "Mrs. Henderson, thank you for coming." "We drove 3 days to get here," Mrs. Henderson said, without complaint, just factually. "I want to see his face when the judge reads that document." She said it with a calm and specific anger that Evelyn recognized, the kind that had been held a long time and refined into something that was no longer hot, but was considerably more durable. "You may get that," Evelyn said. Mr. Henderson shook hands with Caleb with the recognition of 2 men who had been worked by the same person and survived it, and Parsons took them all to a side room and went through what would happen one more time, and Evelyn sat with the tin box on her knees and listened. And when Parsons got to the part about the 1874 document, she opened the box and took it out and set it on the table, and everyone in the room looked at it for a moment in the way people look at something that has traveled a long way and carried a lot. The hearing took 2 days. Whitfield was everything Parsons had predicted. A precise, well-dressed man from back east who handled the legal language with the fluency of someone born to it, and who made arguments that were technically sophisticated and, in the human sense, entirely hollow. He argued the 1874 agreement's expiration with the surveyor he'd brought, a man who had clearly been paid to find an interpretation and had found one, and he argued the Henderson statement with the language of voluntary transaction and settled dispute, and through all of it Crow sat at the table beside him with the pleasant, patient expression of a man who has been in rooms like this before and believes they tend to go his way. Evelyn watched Crow during Whitfield's arguments. She watched him specifically because she had found, in the years since she'd understood what kind of people existed in the world, that the most important information was usually in the person who wasn't talking. Crow sat well. He had a practiced stillness. He looked at the judge with the calm attention of a man performing confidence. But there was a moment. When Parsons put the 1874 document into evidence and the judge read it for the first time and looked up with an expression that was not the neutral face he'd been wearing, but something more specific, something that suggested he was seeing something he recognized. And in that moment, Crow's stillness shifted, just slightly, just enough that if you weren't watching for it, you wouldn't see it. Evelyn saw it. She looked back at the document in the judge's hands and thought about Margaret Whitlock writing the date on the outside of the envelope. Thought about the careful filing of a woman who understood that some things needed to be kept, not because they were immediately useful, but because they were true, and truth has a way of mattering eventually. Judge Alderman was rigorous, as Parsons had said. He asked questions. He asked Parsons questions. He asked Whitfield questions. He asked the Henderson surveyor about the language of expiration clauses in territorial land agreements, and listened to the answer with the attention of a man who already knew enough to evaluate what he was hearing. He asked Mrs. Henderson, on the second morning, to describe in her own words what had happened when Crow's lawyer had told her husband there was an error in their survey. Mrs. Henderson described it in her own words. She was not dramatic about it. She did not embellish. She said what happened in the order it happened, and what it had meant to her family, and what they had lost, and what they had done afterward. And she said all of it in the flat, precise voice of a woman who had held on to the facts of a thing for 2 years because she understood that the facts were what mattered. When she was done, there was a silence in the room. Crow's pleasant expression had not changed, but he had stopped looking at the judge. Judge Alderman took 1 day to deliberate. His ruling was 22 pages, which Parsons read on the stage back to Millhaven with the focused absorption of a man reading something that mattered to his professional life, pausing occasionally to say things like good and yes, exactly, and once, quietly, Margaret, which Evelyn understood was not addressed to her, but to the document itself, to the woman whose records had built the case. The core of it was this: Silas Crow had engaged in a systematic pattern of fraudulent land acquisition in the territory over a period not less than 10 years. The pattern involved misrepresentation of survey records, deliberate manipulation of access agreements, and the use of legal challenges to coerce sales at below-market values. The territorial court found sufficient evidence to refer the matter to the territorial prosecutor for criminal investigation. The South Pasture water rights were confirmed as belonging to the Whitlock property by clear and documented title. The Hendersons were entitled to pursue civil remedy for the loss of their eastern pasture. Any further offers, approaches, or legal filings by Crow or his representatives regarding Whitlock land or Henderson land were to be considered harassment under territorial statute and would be treated accordingly. Crow had 48 hours to vacate a property he had acquired from the original Henderson sale that was now under investigation as a product of fraudulent transaction. Parsons closed the ruling and looked out the stage window at the passing landscape, and after a moment he said, "Margaret Whitlock built this case. She built it before anyone knew it was a case. She just didn't live to see it finished." Caleb, sitting beside Evelyn, said nothing. She looked at the tin box on her lap, which was lighter now without the original documents. They were in Parsons' briefcase, officially entered into territorial record, where they would stay. "She knew it would be needed," Evelyn said. "She just made sure it would be there when it was." Well, they got back to the ranch on a Thursday evening, arriving in the last of the light to find Mrs. Garrett in the kitchen with 3 children who had been kept busy in the way she'd promised, and were now at a level of barely contained need for information that was practically visible, like steam in a pot just before it boils. Clara got one look at their faces and said, "We won." "We won," Caleb said. Lily made a sound that was not quite a word and attached herself to Caleb with the determination of someone who had been patient long enough. Benjamin looked at Evelyn across the room with an expression she recognized, the expression of a child who had been running strategy in his head for days and wanted to know how the real version had compared. "The document worked?" he said. "The document worked," she said. "Your grandmother kept it, and your mother filed it, and it worked." He thought about this, nodded once, with a satisfaction that was deeper than a 9-year-old should have had access to, but then Benjamin had always operated at a depth slightly below his official age. Mrs. Garrett left them to it, which was its own form of grace, knowing when a family needed to be by themselves. They ate supper together, and Caleb told the children about the hearing in the way he told them things, directly and without softening it for youth. And Clara asked the question she had been storing for days with the precision Parsons had noticed, and Benjamin wanted to know specifically what the judge had said when he read the 1874 document, and Lily wanted to know if the bad man was in trouble now. "Yes," Caleb said. "He's in trouble now." Lily considered this with the gravity she applied to moral conclusions. "Good," she said, and went back to her supper. In the weeks that followed, Crow's network began to unravel in the way that things unravel when the first thread has been properly pulled. The territorial prosecutor opened a formal investigation. 2 other ranchers came forward with stories that matched the pattern. Not on Parsons's list, not people Evelyn had known to approach, just people who heard that someone had done something and understood for the first time that what had happened to them had a name and a category. Douglas Hale's connection to Crow became known, not through any action of Evelyn's or Caleb's, but through the investigation, which found correspondence between the 2 men that made Hale's role as a knowing intermediary clear. Hale did not lose his property or his freedom, but he lost something in the community that did not come back, a thing that had no clean name, but that everyone understood. The quality of being trusted by the people around you, which once lost does not simply return because no one has formally taken it. Evelyn did not feel satisfaction about this exactly. She felt something more complicated than satisfaction. The recognition that the removal of a threat rarely felt as clean as you imagined it would when the threat was still present, that what it mostly felt like was the end of a particular kind of vigilance, the release of something you hadn't known you were holding until you were able to set it down. The marriage was in June, which was not a coincidence. June was when the light was longest and the work was manageable, and the children were out of the house enough to allow the brief ceremony at the Millhaven Justice of the Peace, with Parsons as witness and Mrs. Garrett as the second witness, and Clara and Benjamin and Lily standing outside on the steps in their good clothes, waiting. It was not a lavish thing. Caleb had asked her in the kitchen in March in the straightforward way he did things, and she had said yes in the same register, and the ceremony reflected this: two people who had decided something and were making it official without requiring the decision to be performed at a particular volume. Parsons shook Caleb's hand afterward and kissed Evelyn's cheek and said, "Congratulations," in the tone of a man who had watched the last several months and understood that the word covered a great deal of ground. Outside, Clara looked at Evelyn's dress, plain blue, the best she had, which was not particularly grand, and said, "You should have something nicer." "I'm planning to," Evelyn said. "Eventually." "I can sew," Clara said, as if this were information she was disclosing for practical rather than personal reasons. "Mama taught me. I'm actually quite good." "I know you are." Clara looked at her sideways. "You didn't know that." "I've seen the way you mended Benjamin's shirt. The seam work is excellent." Clara's mouth did something it still didn't do often. It moved toward a smile, not all the way, but most of the way there. The family expression, the almost smile that was the Whitlock version of delight. "I'll make you something proper then," she said. "I would like that very much," Evelyn said. Lily had taken her hand at some point during this conversation without comment, a thing she did now with the ease of habit, and she was swinging it gently the way she did when she was content and not thinking about it. And Evelyn looked down at her and then up at the June sky over Millhaven, which was the specific blue of early summer in high country, a blue that had no gray in it at all. There are things you understand about a life only after you've lived enough of it to look back at the shape. Evelyn had believed for a long time that her value was conditional, that it depended on the things she could provide, the roles she could fill, the particular function she served in whatever arrangement she found herself in. She had not known she believed this. She had thought she was practical about her own situation, clear-eyed, realistic. She had thought the long and careful management of her own expectations was a form of wisdom. It was not wisdom. It was what happens when a person has been told, in 100 small ways over a long time, that they are acceptable only within specific parameters, and has internalized the parameters as fact. Montana taught her that this was wrong. Not gently. Montana was not a place that taught things gently, but with the particular clarity of a situation that stripped everything to function and then, in the functioning, revealed something she hadn't expected to find. She had arrived with nothing to offer, or so she had been told. She could not give the ranch more children. She was the wrong size for a frontier wife, the wrong situation for a practical arrangement, the wrong woman for a man who needed something specific, and she was not it. What she turned out to be was the woman who opened a tin box. That sounds smaller than it was. She knew it sounded smaller than it was, and she had decided she didn't particularly care, because the meaning of a thing was not in how it sounded, but in what it did. She had opened a box that a careful, loving woman had been filling for years before she died, and she had understood what was in it, and she had known what to do with what she understood, and that was, in the real accounting, in the accounting that mattered, the whole of it. Not heroic, not seamless, not the triumphant arrival of someone who had all the answers. She had been wrong about things. She had misjudged Crow's timeline twice. She had failed to anticipate Hale's role until it was visible in the fence cutting. She had spent several weeks in a cold room trying to convince herself she was not building something she was not allowed to build. She was a woman with a teaching primer and a tendency to take over the dishes and strong feelings about documentation, and she was also, it turned out, exactly what this particular family, in this particular situation, needed at exactly the moment they needed it. That convergence was not something she could have planned or predicted. It was simply what had happened. The way the right key is simply the right key, not because it was designed for that lock from the beginning, but because the fit turned out to be real. Summer settled over the ranch with the particular ease of a season that has earned itself. The south barn was fully rebuilt and smelled of new timber that would take years to acquire the smell of the old. The north fence held. The South Pasture Creek ran clear through July, which had been a dry summer in that particular corner of Montana, and the ranchers on the other side of the ridge came to Caleb to discuss access, which they did because that was what neighbors did, and the water was shared without ceremony because sharing it was the right thing to do, and because Caleb Whitlock was not Silas Crow. Benjamin was well. He had not had a serious chest episode since February, and he had the look of a child growing into his constitution. He was still not a large boy, probably never would be, but there was a steadiness to him now that had not been there in January. Something settled in the way he moved through the world. He had started a project of writing down the history of the ranch, which he had announced with the seriousness of someone filing a formal proposal, and which Evelyn had encouraged with books from Ruth Albright's collection and the guidance that good history required primary sources, which had sent him directly to the tin box. "Can I read everything in here?" he asked. "Ask your father," she said. He asked his father. Caleb said yes, with the addendum that everything in the box was to be treated carefully and returned exactly as found, which Benjamin received with the gravity of a person being entrusted with something important. He spent 3 afternoons working through the contents, making notes in the small, careful handwriting he'd developed, and when he was done, he brought the box back to the shelf and said to Evelyn, she thought about everything. "Well, yes," Evelyn said. "Did she know that someone would need all of it?" "I don't think she knew exactly. I think she understood that things go wrong in ways you can't predict, and the best you can do is make sure the truth is somewhere that can be found." She looked at the box on the shelf, and she trusted the people who came after her to know what to do with it. Benjamin thought about this for a long moment. "That's a lot of trust," he said. "Yes." "For someone she never met." "Yes." He was quiet, looking at the box. "Do you think she would have—" He stopped. Started again, more carefully. "Do you think she would have minded you being here?" She looked at him. 9 years old, almost 10 now, with his careful eyes and his history project and his mother's tin box on the shelf above his head. "I think she would have minded very much if the people she loved weren't taken care of," she said, "and I think she was practical enough to care more about that than anything else." Benjamin considered this with the seriousness he gave to conclusions. Then he nodded, once, the way he nodded when something settled into place. He went back outside to whatever he'd been doing. Evelyn stood in the kitchen for a moment longer, looking at the shelf. In the evenings that summer, when the work was done and the light was long and the children were in that extended twilight state of being not quite ready for bed, Caleb and Evelyn would sometimes sit on the porch steps while the day finished, not always talking, sometimes just there. Two people who had found each other through a series of events that neither of them would have chosen, and both of them had survived, sitting in the particular quiet of people who have said what needed to be said and do not need to keep saying it. He was still not a smooth man. He still communicated in function and practicality and the occasional almost smile. He still left coffee made in the mornings. He had developed the habit of putting things he found on her work table, a stone with an interesting shape, a feather from something he couldn't identify, without comment or explanation, just setting them there and leaving them there, which was his way, she had come to understand, of saying I was thinking of you in a language that did not require saying it. She was still opinionated. She still took over things she thought could be done better, and she still had strong feelings about documentation. And she still lay awake sometimes running problems through their possible shapes before she could set them down and sleep. She was not easy. She had never claimed to be easy. Caleb had not, as it turned out, needed easy. He had needed someone who would open the box. Clara made her the dress in August. It was blue, a better blue than the June wedding dress, cut with a competence that was genuinely remarkable for a 12-year-old and included small details at the cuffs that Clara had added without mentioning them. A tiny embroidered line, the kind of thing a person learns from watching someone who is very good at it and who is no longer there to show them. Evelyn put it on and stood in front of the small mirror in her room, their room now, and looked at herself in it. She was 31 years old and large and gray-eyed, and her hair still did whatever it decided to do, and she was wearing a dress made by a girl who had decided to give her something beautiful, and she looked at herself the way she had always looked at herself, which was to see what was there and not add to it or subtract from it. What was there was a woman who was home. She went out to show Clara, who examined the fit with the critical eye of a craftsperson, assessing their own work, and found 2 things she wanted to correct, and 1 thing she was satisfied with. Lily declared it the most beautiful dress she had ever seen, which was the Lily version of a formal endorsement. Benjamin looked up from his history project long enough to say it looked nice, which from Benjamin was a significant compliment. Caleb looked at her across the supper table that evening and said, "You look well." It was the kind of thing he said, precise, understated, meaning more than it contained. "Thank you," she said. Outside, the long summer light was finally beginning to soften, the first hint of the amber that came when August started its slow turn toward fall, and the ranch, the rebuilt south barn, and the clear running creek, and the new timber smell mixed with the old wood smell, and the horse smell, and the smell of something cooking, and children somewhere outside calling to each other in the way children do when the evening is warm enough to stay in, sat in it the way a thing sits in the light it was built for. She had not been wanted here. She had come anyway, because there was nowhere else to go. And she had stayed because she had opened a box and understood what was in it, and she had found that the things she had been told she lacked, the things that were supposed to make her insufficient, incomplete, not enough, had turned out to be beside the point entirely. A family is made the way most real things are made, not all at once, not without difficulty, not by people who knew what they were doing from the beginning. It is made by people who showed up on a cold porch with their best coat and their pinned hair and their teaching primer, who stayed when they could have left and looked when they could have turned away, who took 10 minutes when 10 minutes was what they could afford, and then got up and went to find the child who couldn't sleep. It is made, in the end, by the daily choosing of it, by the coffee left made in the mornings, by the button that matches, by the shelf that no longer wobbles, by the document saved in a tin box by a woman who understood that truth needs somewhere to live and trusted the future to find it. Evelyn Whitmore. Evelyn Whitlock, now, the name still new enough to feel slightly like someone else's before she remembered it was hers, sat at the table where she had first drunk terrible coffee while a man looked at his hands and told her she was not what he needed. She looked at the shelf where the tin box sat. She looked at her family at the table. She drank her coffee, which was considerably better now, because she had learned how Caleb made it, and had made one small adjustment, and neither of them had mentioned the adjustment because neither of them needed to. Outside, the Montana evening did what it did, and inside the lamp was lit, and the table was full, and that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.